Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where the morning doesn't really begin with sunlight, or a rooster crowing, or even a sleepy stretch, but with ale. Yes, actual ale. First thing in the morning. You'd barely have your eyes open and already someone's shoving a wooden cup into your hands because in medieval Europe this wasn't a party choice, it was survival. Water could betray you faster than a tax collector, full of things that would absolutely rearrange your insides, and not in a fun way. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening right now, drop your location and your local time. It's always wild to see where everyone is drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into a medieval morning fog still hanging low, chickens judging, you, and the distant sound of a smith hammering entirely too early. And there, on the rough wooden table, sits your breakfast, a bowl of porridge and a cup of ale. Not strong ale, the weak, watered-down stuff, but still unmistakably alcohol. You lift it, take a slow sip, and feel that familiar warmth spreading through you. Not enough to make you stumble, but enough to remind you that, centuries from now, people will find this hilarious. The thing is, everyone drank this way. Adults, workers, priests, merchants. Even kids had small ale, which was barely alcoholic but still technically booze. One mainstream historical fact that always catches people off guard is that in many towns, ale consumption could hit 2 to 3 litres per person per day. Not because people were staggering through life like a never-ending pub crawl, but because this was the safe liquid. A tiny bit of fermentation meant fewer deadly microbes. Historians still argue whether the alcohol content alone truly made medieval drink safer, or whether boiling the mash during brewing did most of the germ-killing work. Either way, you grab your cup and sip along with everyone else, because survival apparently comes with a light buzz. You glance over to the corner, where a neighbour is already finishing his second cup, even though the sun isn't fully up. But that's normal. Medieval people weren't drunk all day, they were lightly warmed, like humans operating at 15% toast level. It also didn't help that breakfast in many places was consumed mid-morning after hours of work. So technically, by the time you're having breakfast ale, you've already been awake since 4 or 5 a.m., hauling hay, or praying, or chasing goats. Ale at this point feels deserved. A quirky little tidbit. Some households kept a running ale pot, basically a constantly bubbling ongoing brew, like a medieval sourdough starter, but for getting mildly buzzed. You'd scoop out what you needed, top up, with more grains and water, and let the fermentation keep chugging. Was it delicious? Absolutely not. But you weren't here for flavor, you were here for hydration that wouldn't kill you. As you sip, that faint, grainy sweetness hits your tongue. Medieval ale was often cloudy, thick, and a little chewy, much more liquid bread than modern beer. And yes, you'd absolutely find bits of grain floating in the cup. You drink around them like a champion. Outside, the village is waking up. You hear the clatter of wooden buckets, the shuffle of workers heading toward fields already damp with dew. Everyone is carrying their own small flask or jug, some wrapped with leather ties, because drinking throughout the day was as normal as wearing shoes today. You'd refill as needed at home, at work, or at the local alewife's hut because most brewing was done by women. They ruled the early morning alcohol economy long before men and monasteries industrialized the craft. A man passing by gives you a nod, the kind of nod that says, "Ah, yes, you're also starting the day mildly buzzed on purpose." You nod back, completely understanding. The air still carries the smell of mashed grain husks, warm water, a hint of yeast. Wood smoke drifts from a nearby hearth, where another batch of ale is quietly bubbling. Brewing was constant, because ale spoiled quickly. Without hops, which were not yet universal across Europe, ale had a short shelf life. Some places added herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow, both of which could give you more than a buzz if you weren't careful. One strange fringe tidbit. Some of these herbs had mild psychoactive properties, and while people weren't exactly hallucinating dragons, they definitely experienced effects that went beyond modern beer. Historians still debate whether early brewed ales actually produce stronger intoxicating impacts or if it's just exaggerated in folklore. You wipe your mouth with your sleeve, medieval style, and take another sip. The warmth spreads, your shoulders drop a little, and your mind slips into that same state. Countless medieval people lived in a gentle, almost cozy fuzziness. Not enough to lose control, but enough to make the cold morning less rude. It's interesting how normalized it all feels. Nobody is whispering, judging, or raising an eyebrow. Being sober all day would actually make people think something was wrong. Maybe you were sick, maybe cursed, or maybe just deeply unpleasant to be around. Sobriety wasn't a virtue, it was a red flag. A rooster screams in the distance, and you decide he probably needs ale too. The morning continues. Workers pick up tools. Children chase each other between mud huts. The alewife steps out of her doorway, apron flour-dusted, calling out that a fresh batch will be ready by midday if anyone wants to reserve a jug. People perk up immediately. Even in a time before clocks, everyone somehow knows when ale o'clock is. And you still, holding your cup, take one more sip before getting on with your day, just like millions of medieval Europeans did. Slightly buzzed, lightly hydrated, and blissfully unaware that in the future, people will call this the boring part of history. You step back from the morning haze and drift toward the real heart of medieval drinking culture, the brewers. Not the sleek industrial kind, the backyard, apron-dusty, quietly overworked kind. Brewing wasn't some special profession tucked away in guild halls at first. It was the work of everyday people, especially women. You wander behind a small timber house, and there she is, the alewife, sleeves rolled high, stirring a giant bubbling tub like she's summoning something mildly dangerous. The scent hits you first, warm grain, earthy steam, and a hint of sweetness that clings to the air like morning bread. It's comforting, but in that, you probably shouldn't inhale this too deeply kind of way. If you've ever walked into a modern brewery and thought, wow, that's a lot of yeast. Imagine that. But in someone's yard, with chickens pecking dangerously close to the brew pot and the family dog absolutely judging you. A mainstream historical fact that anchors this whole scene. For a huge portion of the Middle Ages, brewing was primarily a household task. Not a business, not a profession, just as normal as baking bread or chopping vegetables. Every house needed drinkable liquid, so every house brewed. Alewives and sometimes entire families would make batch after batch because ale didn't last long. No refrigeration, no hops in many regions, and no expectation that your drink would remain stable for more than a few days. Freshness wasn't a marketing slogan, it was survival. You watch her stir. The mash thickens. She wipes her brow with the back of her hand and shoos away a goose who is clearly plotting theft. Brewing was sweaty, repetitive, tricky work, which makes it all the more amusing. That medieval men frequently mocked alewives in poems, plays, and moral sermons, while simultaneously relying on them every single day to not die of bad water. Historians still argue whether this negative portrayal came from genuine suspicion about brewing quality or from simple misogyny. Though, honestly, medieval satire wasn't subtle. A quirky tidbit floats through your mind. Some alewives hung a broom or a bundle of twigs outside the door to signal that fresh ale was ready. It was basically a medieval open sign, but with more witchy energy. This small custom later fed into folklore that witches flew on brooms, mostly because unmarried or widowed brewers ran their businesses alone, handled money, and this is the real sin, successfully operated in male-dominated economies. You shift your weight as the alewife pours the mash into another wooden tub. No stainless steel, no thermometers, just pure intuition, experience, and the occasional prayer she sprinkles crushed herbs into the mixture, not hops, but something called brewed. Depending on the region, that mixture might include yarrow, mugwort, rosemary, juniper, bog myrtle, or other plants that today would have you Googling, is this safe for human consumption? And here's the fun part. Some of these herbs were mildly intoxicating or psychoactive. Nothing wild, but definitely enough to make people feel something extra after a long day. Medieval drinking didn't always hit the same way twice. You might sip an ale one day that's basically thick oatmeal water, and the next day, a brew that gently rearranges your mood. You take a small imaginary sip of her concoction and feel warmth spreading through your chest like a soft candle glow. The alewife lifts the ladle to inspect clarity. It is absolutely not clear. In fact, you're pretty sure you see a tiny fleck of barley swirling like a doomed fish. But this was the norm. Medieval ale was thick, cloudy, chunky, and often included bits of grain. If you gulped too fast, you risked unexpected chewing. You drink slowly, both because you have manners and because you have survival instincts. Children wander by with small pottery cups, dipping into the first weak run of the brew called small ale. It's barely alcoholic, but it keeps them hydrated without turning their stomachs against them. A few sips, and they're off again, chasing chickens, screaming joyfully, and unknowingly participating in Europe's earliest hydrating strategy. As you move closer, warmth from the brewing tubs wraps around you. Steam curls upward like lazy ghosts. The alewife explains, with the dry tone of a woman who said this 1,000 times, that brewing is done several times a week, sometimes daily. That's how fast ale spoils, especially unhopped varieties. If she doesn't keep brewing, the neighborhood goes thirsty. If the neighborhood goes thirsty, everyone becomes cranky. And medieval cranky is not something you want to witness. She strains the mash through a wooden sieve. A woven basket catches the grain husks, and you realize nothing goes to waste. Spent mash becomes animal feed, fertilizer, or thick bread for the poorest folk. Medieval economy was very reduce, reuse, recycle, mostly because there was no alternative. You look around the small yard, wooden tubs, pottery jugs cooling in the shade, a makeshift workbench covered in dried herbs, and a single tiny barrel sitting proudly like the star of the show. The tools look humble, even crude, but they represent centuries of tradition. A neighbor arrives, a lanky man holding a jug. He pays in coins, eggs, or sometimes bread. Currency was flexible when it came to ale. He and the alewife exchange a few words about how strong this batch is. She shrugs in a way that does not reassure you. Strength varied wildly. Without standardized recipes, people judged potency by taste, smell, or by simply drinking it and waiting to see how many minutes passed, before the world tilted at a slight angle. Historians still argue whether most household ale was consistently weak, or if medieval people enjoyed a larger variety of strengths throughout the week. Evidence points both ways, depending on region, resources, and the brewer's personal philosophy about how drunk is too drunk for a Tuesday morning. The neighbor takes a cautious sip, nods, and smiles. That's the universal medieval sign for, yep, I can work after this. You lean against a wattle fence, watching sunlight touch the bubbling surface of the brew. This is where your day's hydration and tiny daily buzz truly begins. Backyard tubs, women who mastered their craft, and communities built around the ancient art of controlled fermentation. Not glamorous, not refined, but essential. And as you take another slow, warm sip, you start to realize that boring medieval history isn't boring at all. It's just quiet, lived in, and human, just like this alewife's humble little yard, where survival and comfort blend in every foggy cup. You drift from the alewife's yard with the faint scent of steam and grain still clinging to your clothes. And you carry your cup with you because the day's just starting. And in medieval Europe, your hydration strategy is basically keep sipping and hope for the best. But as you wander down the muddied lane, you start noticing something important. Not all ale tastes the same. Some cups feel like warm breakfast cereal. Others hit you with a surprising wallop that makes you blink twice, stare at the ground, and reconsider your life choices. That's because medieval people didn't think of beer and ale in the neat categories we have today. Instead, you lived in a world of weak ale and strong ale, and depending on which one you grabbed, your day unfolded very differently. You lift your cup and swirl it in that fancy way wine enthusiasts do today. It does not swirl. It sloshes like a tiny, actively annoyed swamp, but you're committed. Weak ale, sometimes called small ale, is what most people drank all day. Think of it as mildly alcoholic tea, hydrating, safe, a little comforting, and just buzzy enough to make the back-breaking daily grind feel slightly less like punishment for something your ancestors did wrong. And honestly, given how medieval mornings smelled manure, smoke, old wool, the crushing knowledge that you're about to work from sunrise to sunset, this subtle morning buzz probably kept the entire village civil. A mainstream historical fact. Many households brewed multiple runs from the same mash. First run, strong ale. Second run, middling ale. Third run, small ale. By the end, you're basically drinking barley-flavored wishful thinking. You pass a group of workers heading toward the fields. One man sips from a thick pottery mug with the solemnity of someone who has accidentally grabbed strong ale instead of small ale. He is now going to weed turnips, while operating at a casual 20% shipwrecked sailor. Poor guy. You, meanwhile, have the opposite problem. The ale in your cup is so weak you're pretty sure it's flirting with the concept of water. Medieval brewing wasn't precise. Without standardized measurements, or any measurements, really strength came down to ingredient quality, how long it fermented, who brewed it, and whether the brewer got distracted by literally anything else. Historians still argue whether most medieval ale was consistently weak or if dosage varied wildly depending on the batch and region. You take another sip and decide it's probably the latter. A quirky little tidbit tickles your mind. Some medieval drinkers genuinely believed strong ale could heat the liver, stir the spirits, or wake the humours. Basically, proto-medical ways of saying, this will absolutely knock you on your medieval backside. Herbal manuals and household guides talked about ale strength, like modern people talk, about coffee roast levels just with more references to bodily fluids. You drift toward a brew shop where a few barrels sit outside on wooden stands. A small crowd gathers, all examining the day's offerings like they're comparing phone plans. The alewife behind the counter gestures to two barrels. This one's mild, she says, patting a smaller cask. This one'll sit you down. You love her clarity. People step forward, sniffing the ale, swirling it, tapping the barrel like that somehow reveals anything. A merchant tries the strong ale first. You swear you see his soul leave his body momentarily. His hat even tilts backward from the impact. He nods politely and pretends he isn't instantly regretting every decision that led him here. In the countryside, weak ale was the hydration backbone of daily life. But in towns, strong ale had its own fan club. Craftsmen drank it after long shifts. Tavern regulars swore it helped with storytelling, and it absolutely did. Nobles even ordered strong ale for feasts. Not because it paired with food, but because nothing says festivity, like half your guests gently slumping sideways during dessert. You stroll through a narrow lane, and behind a wooden shutter, you hear someone loudly insisting they're completely fine, in the exact tone of someone who is not completely fine. Strong ale strikes again. Weak ale, though? That's your reliable friend. People drank it at breakfast, during field work, with lunch, in the afternoon, at dinner, and often before bed. It was cheap, fast to brew, and didn't sit heavy on the stomach. Some even flavored it with herbs to make it taste vaguely less like warm cereal. But here's a fun detail. Because hops weren't yet universal across Europe, ale had nothing slowing down spoilage. Weak ale turned sour quickly, sometimes within a day. Taking a sip too late might give you that face you make when milk is definitely not milk anymore. You pause beside a small stream. The water looks fine, clearish, sparkling, tempting. You crouch down, stare at it, and then remember that you enjoy not spending your afternoon curled into a fetal ball regretting your hydration choices. You stand back up and sip your ale instead. You may be a bit buzzed, but at least you're not dead. Further ahead, a couple of men debate the difference between good, strong ale and bad, strong ale. The distinction appears to be, one makes you sing loudly on the way home, the other makes you mistake a barn for your own house. Medieval Yelp reviews were very straightforward. One of them lifts a jug and hands it to you. You take a cautious sip. Your eyebrows immediately try to escape your forehead. That stuff could strip paint. He beams with pride. Strong enough? He asks. You nod politely, because you cannot physically nod impolitely right now. Historians still argue whether medieval people developed alcohol tolerance as part of daily life, or if they were simply used to lower strength drinks except on special occasions. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Constant small doses made people buzz-ready, but strong ale still knocked them sideways when brewed aggressively. You wander away, cup in hand, mind warm and pleasantly fuzzy. Weak ale keeps you hydrated. Strong ale keeps you honest and occasionally horizontal. And somewhere between the two, medieval life meanders forward, with everyone taking careful, calculated sips to stay comfortably functional. You pause at the crossroads, lift your cup, and let the grainy, slightly sour warmth settle into your chest. Strong or weak, cloudy or chewy, every mug has a story, and yours is just getting started. You leave the bustle of town behind and wander toward a quieter part of medieval life, the monasteries. And honestly, if you thought monks spent all day in silent prayer and stoic fasting, you're about to get your worldview gently but firmly rearranged. Because tucked behind those thick stone walls, past the cloisters and scripted manuscripts, is one of the greatest medieval brewing operations Europe ever saw. You step through a wooden gate, boots tapping on worn stones, and the air shifts. It smells different here, cleaner, calmer, tinged with herbs and beeswax, with the faint, sweet warmth of fermenting grain drifting from some hidden corner. Monks move quietly, their robes brushing the ground, every step careful and deliberate. And yet, you can feel it, a soft hum of something else, a quiet buzz, literal and metaphorical. The monk guiding you is serene, peaceful, radiating holiness. He also has the faintest flush in his cheeks, the kind of glow you get from just a sip or two of the good stuff. You're pretty sure he'd deny it, but you're even more sure he'd be lying. Because here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval monasteries were some of the most skilled, consistent, and innovative brewers in Europe. They had access to grain, clean water sources, controlled environments, and most importantly, time. Time to experiment, time to perfect their craft, time to make beverages that were safe, nourishing, and surprisingly strong. You follow the monk into a large stone room where copper kettles bubble quietly. Steam floats upward in slow trails. Barley sacks line the walls. Shelves hold carefully labeled herbs. Everything is organized with almost comical precision. In a world where most people eyeballed every measurement, monks actually measured things. They took notes. They cared deeply about consistency, more than you care about most things in your life. One monk stirs a vat of mash with the focus of someone conducting surgery. Another chants gently while adding herbs. A third carefully tests the temperature, his brow furrowed, as though he's discovering quantum physics instead of checking if hot water is hot. You watch as they strain liquid into barrels, each one marked with the date, grain type, and strength. That's right, monks had brewing categories, stronger beers for feast days and guests, lighter ones for everyday consumption. And the really hearty batches? Those were reserved for Lent, when solids were limited but liquids were conveniently allowed. Medieval loopholes were truly works of art, a quirky tidbit that flickers into your mind. Some monasteries brewed liquid bread, thick, calorie-dense beer that was so nourishing it functioned as a meal replacement. Records show monks consuming multiple liters on fasting days, technically obeying the rules while also being well-fed, hydrated, and pleasantly warm in the soul. People later joked that monks may have been the only medieval Europeans who genuinely enjoyed fasting season. You wander to the cloister garden. Sunlight slants across herbs, fennel, sage, lavender, hyssop, all grown for medicine, cooking, and yes, brewing. Monks often added herbs for flavor or medicinal benefit. Some combinations probably tasted heavenly. Others probably tasted like regret. But monks approached brewing with spiritual seriousness. Every barrel was crafted with care and tasted with enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether monks drank heavily or simply consumed moderate amounts more regularly than the average person. On one hand, monastic rules often emphasized moderation. On the other hand, we have records. Lots of records. And our stocks of ale are tragically low. Please send more immediately. Moderation, apparently, was relative. A quiet bell rings, calling monks to their midday meal. You join them in the refectory, long wooden tables, a reader reciting scripture, bowls of stew steaming in the dim light, and at every seat, a cup, earthenware, heavy, filled with ale brewed hours, days, or sometimes weeks before. You sit, you sip. It's good, like unexpectedly good, smooth, warm, lightly herbal, with none of the chewiness you've grown used to in household ale. The monks exchange soft glances that say, "Yes, we know." They're humble about everything except brewing. And even then, humility is sometimes replaced with just a touch of smugness. Your guide explains that monks brewed not just for themselves, but for travelers, pilgrims, the poor, nearby villages, and sometimes even for sale. Monastic beer helped fund hospitals, libraries, and schools. It wasn't just a drink, it was an economic engine. He also notes, in a very monk-like whisper, that strong ale is kept in a different storeroom. For special occasions, he says. His eyes sparkle. You know exactly what that means. You continue sipping, feeling that familiar medieval warmth slide through your chest like a soft lantern glow. You look around the refectory, where monks quietly enjoy their meal. Their faces are calm, their shoulders relaxed. Maybe it's prayer, discipline, faith, or maybe the ale helps a little too. You wouldn't survive monastic rules today, but you could definitely survive the beer. When the meal ends, the monk leads you back outside, past the stone walls humming with whispered prayers and bubbling kettles. This place is peaceful, skilled, purposeful, and somehow both holier and drunker than you expected. And as you step through the gate, leaving the monastery behind, a gentle buzz follows you like a blessing wrapped in barley and warm steam. You leave the monastery's calm, herb-scented air behind and step straight back into medieval reality, which is to say, noise. A lot of noise. Because ahead of you is the beating, sloshing, occasionally staggering heart of medieval social life, the tavern. And if the monastery felt like gentle warmth and quiet spiritual buzz, the tavern feels like a warm, chaotic hug from someone who has definitely already had 3 mugs too many. The door creaks as you push it open. Light spills out golden, smoky, flickering from a dozen candles that are absolutely not placed safely. The moment you step inside, the smell hits you like a wooden tankard to the face. Ale, sweat, wood smoke, wet wool, roasted meat, more ale, and that mysterious medieval aroma you can never quite describe but always recognize immediately. Every table is full. Long benches packed with people leaning in close, laughing, whispering, arguing, slamming mugs, telling stories, and occasionally just staring at the wall like they're trying to remember what century they're in. You slide into a corner seat with your cup, and instantly someone nods at you as though they've known you for years. Tavern friendships operate on an unspoken rule. If you're here, you're one of them. A tavern worker hair wrapped in a linen cap, sleeves rolled, high slams down 2 mugs in front of a pair of merchants who immediately toast to good trade with the aggressive enthusiasm of people who definitely haven't experienced good trade in months. The tavern is the great social equalizer, a mainstream historical fact. In many medieval towns, common folk, travelers, laborers, artisans, and sometimes even lower-ranking nobles all mixed in taverns. Sure, the elites often preferred private halls or inns, but nothing beat a tavern for raw human connection. Alcohol softened class lines faster than a royal decree. You sip from your cup and taste the difference immediately. This isn't the backyard ale of Section 2 or the refined monastic brew of Section 4. Tavern ale is strong. Strong in the you feel it behind your eyes way. Strong in the you suddenly understand every life decision you've ever made way. You set the mug down gently, unsure whether you should respect it or fear it. Across the room, a man stands on a bench, retelling a story about a fox stealing his sausage. Again, everyone already knows this story. He tells it every night. And yet everyone still laughs, partly because humor was scarce, and partly because the ale is flowing like gossip at a royal wedding. A quirky tidbit surfaces in your mind. Medieval taverns often served as informal news hubs. Travelers brought tales from other towns, messengers stopped in for drink, and gossip spread faster than the ale ran out. In a world without newspapers, taverns were the closest thing to CNN, just with worse accuracy and better beverages. You watch a pair of women arm wrestling. Yes, that happened. They grip hands over a sticky wooden table, both laughing as the crowd cheers around them. A sheepish-looking scholar tries to take notes while sipping from his mug, but his ink keeps smearing and his handwriting is already sliding into ancient curse territory. People lean close to talk, not because they're whispering, but because taverns were loud, very loud. Medieval buildings had 0 sound insulation, and every slammed mug echoed like Judgment Day. You lean forward too, participating in the ancient ritual of I can't hear you, but I'll nod anyway. Historians still argue whether medieval taverns were primarily places of relaxation, or whether they doubled as hotbeds of political debate, criminal plotting, or low-key rebellion. The answer is almost certainly yes. Taverns were both comfortable social spaces and slightly dangerous melting pots, but mostly they were where people felt alive. A group of farmers nearby start a drinking song, and you immediately recognize the melody, even though you've never heard it before. That's the magic of tavern music. It always sounds familiar the moment you hear it. They bang mugs, stomp boots, and one man attempts harmony with the same confidence as a goose honking into the void. The tavern keeper, broad shoulders, booming voice, moves from table to table with the authority of someone who has broken up more fights than the local sheriff. He pours refills, wipes spills, and hands out warnings with equal energy. Drink, talk, laugh, no knives tonight, he mutters as he passes a particularly rowdy table. The men nod solemnly, as if they obey this rule at least 50% of the time. You notice a small back room with dimmer light and fewer people. That's where merchants negotiate deals, gamblers make silent wagers, and travelers nurse hangovers they haven't even earned yet. A hooded figure sits alone, staring into his cup with intense, dramatic flair. Every tavern has at least one person doing that. A mug suddenly appears in your hand. You didn't ask for it. It simply happened. Taverns operate on magical realism. Alcohol materializes. Stories multiply. Time becomes a gentle suggestion. You take a sip. This batch is somehow both sweeter and stronger. Your eyebrows raise. Your soul vibrates gently. Someone nearby asks where you're from. You answer vaguely, because explaining the future, where we drink coffee instead of ale at 7 a.m., would cause problems. They nod like your vague answer was incredibly profound. The night continues in a warm blur. People drift from table to table, sharing stories, jokes, secrets. A merchant complains about taxes. A baker complains about grain shortages. A young man brags about catching a fish, this big, holding his hands so far apart, you suspect he's trying to describe a dolphin. It's chaotic, loud, sticky, human. You drink, you laugh, you exist entirely in the moment. And as you finally step out into the cool night air buzzed, warm, and still hearing faint singing, you understand why medieval people loved taverns so deeply, not for the alcohol alone, but for the company, the escape, the permission to be briefly, beautifully free. You don't get far from the tavern before you start noticing something that medieval people understood instinctively. You can drink, but you can't drink however you want. Even in a world built on ale, there were rules, actual, enforceable rules about public drunkenness. And tonight, you wander through a town where those rules quietly shape your every step. The night air is cool, the sky washed in fading blue, and the street smells like wood smoke, manure, and that unique medieval blend of spices, sweat, and someone definitely burned their dinner. You stroll past crooked houses and shuttered shops, and you can still hear faint tavern laughter echoing behind you. Ahead, two men sway near a horse trough, arguing about something extremely important like whose boots are wetter. You watch them, amused, until a town constable strolls over with the exact expression of a man who has dealt with this situation too many times to count. On your feet, home, now, he says, in the tone parents use when they're done negotiating, and the men obey, immediately, heads down, boots shuffling, because here's a mainstream historical fact. Most medieval towns had strict regulations about public drunkenness. People could drink all they wanted at home, at feasts, at taverns, but once you stepped into the street, you were expected to behave. You couldn't brawl, shout, block traffic, that is to say, horses, or generally exist like chaos incarnate. That could earn you a fine, stocks, or a very cold night in a local holding cell. You continue walking, and a woman sweeping her doorway gives you the once-over. She narrows her eyes slightly, assessing your steadiness. Medieval communities policed behavior socially as much as legally. If you looked too wobbly, neighbors took note. If you acted out, neighbors talked. If you embarrassed the community, neighbors talked louder. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind. Some towns used literal watchmen of the drink, appointed citizens who patrolled streets at night, specifically to check for disorderly drunks. Imagine your nosiest neighbor, but with legal authority and a lantern. You pass a small crowd gathered near a notice board. You lean in, pretending to read, even though the handwriting looks like someone wrote with their non-dominant foot. The notice lists fines, disturbing the peace, damaging property, drunken brawling, and your favorite being riotously drunk past curfew. That is an official medieval category. And you know someone absolutely got famous in their village for achieving it. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely effective or just symbolic attempts to control tavern culture. Some scholars say enforcement was rare. Others argue towns took these rules seriously to keep order in cramped communities where everything echoed and everyone knew everyone else's business. Truth? Probably a messy mix of both, like most medieval policies. You drift toward the central square. A man is loudly reciting poetry from atop a barrel. A sober person would not choose this barrel, it is clearly unstable, but he is committed to his art. Unfortunately for him, a constable rounds the corner. Down, the constable says flatly. The man freezes mid-verse. But it's a love poem, he protests. Down. He gets down. Evening strolls were common in medieval towns, but so were accident-prone drunk wanderers who bumped into market stalls, knocked over oil lamps, or confused goats for humans. So city ordinances popped up to curb the chaos. You could drink, you could buzz, but you could not, under any circumstances, try to joust invisible enemies with a broom in the town square. Someone had done that. Probably multiple someones. As you turn down an alley, you notice another interesting detail. Homeowners kept water barrels outside their doors, not for drinking, but for rinsing or redirecting drunks who got too bold near the windows. Public urination laws existed long before modern cities, enforced by shame, fines, or being personally rinsed like a disobedient cat. A group of older women nearby gossip while spinning wool. One of them gestures toward the tavern with her spindle. "They'll have trouble tonight," she whispers. "It's payday." Everyone nods knowingly. Taverns got rowdiest when wages hit pockets, and communities prepared accordingly, some with sand buckets for fires, others with extra watchmen, and others with prayer. You approach a small church and see a young clerk outside, rubbing his temples. He's wearing the universal expression of someone mixed ale strength categories today. He sees you and waves vaguely. "Moderation," he mutters. "Scripture says moderation." You nod sympathetically. Inside the church, you hear singing slightly off-key, slightly slurred. Medieval spirituality and alcohol had a long, entangled relationship, and you're seeing the wobbly edges of it up close. A constable walks past you, lantern swinging, scanning for trouble. "All's well?" he calls out. You nod. He nods. You both pretend you're not 2 seconds from doing something that might technically count as loitering. Somewhere behind you, a fight nearly breaks out over a dropped loaf of bread. Voices rise. A mug slams. But before it gets serious, the tavern keeper storms outside, seizing both men by the collars like misbehaving puppies. "Take it home," he growls. "Not on my doorstep." Tavern keepers held surprising authority. They were responsible for their patrons, and towns held them accountable. If your customers started too many fights, you got fined. If they drew knives, you got in trouble. If they burned something, you answered for it. Medieval bars had liability issues centuries before the modern insurance industry. You continue walking, feeling the faint, mellow comfort of earlier drinks settle in. You're not staggering. You're not singing fox-themed ballads. You're simply existing in that gentle medieval hum of slightly warmed that people considered completely normal. And as you reach the edge of town, lantern lights glowing like sleepy fireflies, you realize something important. In medieval Europe, drinking wasn't dangerous. But drinking publicly, loudly, stupidly, or inconveniently, that was an art form with consequences. You keep walking through the quiet medieval night, lanterns flickering, boots tapping against uneven stone, and inevitably your mind drifts to a truth everyone in this world knows, because sooner or later, even the most joyful tavern night ends with a reckoning. Not divine, not legal, a hangover. And if you think your modern hangovers are bad, buckle up, medieval ones could make a grown knight cry into his helmet. But don't worry, You're easing into this gently, with that same sleepy, warm tone you've settled into tonight. You wake at dawn in a straw-stuffed bed, head pounding, mouth dry, and a faint sense that someone wrung you out like an old rag and left you to dry near the hearth. The room tilts slightly, not dramatically, just enough to remind you that you definitely misjudged the strength of last night's ale. A rooster screams outside your window. You consider throwing something at it. You realize you don't have anything to throw. Medieval life is cruel like that. You push yourself upright, and everything aches. Shoulders, back, even emotions. And you're not alone across Europe. Countless people have woken exactly like this since the first person looked at fermented grain and said, "Yeah, I'll drink it." A mainstream historical fact. Medieval hangovers were absolutely recognized, documented, and treated, even though people didn't use the modern word for it. Physicians called it crapula, from the Latin crapula, meaning drunkenness, which, in the gentlest possible way, tells you everything you need to know about medieval medical judgment. You stumble toward a wooden basin and splash cold water on your face. It helps, only a little. Mostly it just wakes you up enough to notice how badly your head hurts. Somewhere, you can still hear last night's tavern song replaying in your mind like an annoying medieval ringtone. A neighbor passing by your window chuckles. "Rough night?" he calls, with the perfect amount of smugness only. Someone not suffering a hangover can deploy. You grunt something that might be a word. He nods solemnly, like he's witnessed a universal human tragedy. Now, the remedies. Oh, the remedies. The medieval world had no shortage of hangover cures, and nearly all of them fall somewhere between mildly helpful and absolute nonsense. You look around for options. On the table sits a small bowl of something. It smells like regret. This is your first remedy. Warm eel broth mixed with bitter herbs. People swore by it. The logic? Eel was considered moist, supposedly balancing the dryness caused by alcohol. You take a sip. It tastes like salty mud and lost hope. You put it down. A quirky tidbit floats up. One 14th century medical manuscript suggested hangover victims inhale the steam of boiled cabbage. Another recommended stuffing your nose with mint leaves. Another your favorite claimed roasted owl eggs cured all drunken after effects. You're not entirely convinced these cures. They were based on science and not just creative pranks. You lie back down for a moment, hand over your eyes. Medieval houses don't have curtains, so the sunlight is stabbing you directly in the soul. You sit up again and reach for a jug of small ale. Yes, more alcohol. The medieval hair of the dog. You hesitate, but honestly, your head hurts so badly it's worth trying. You sip. Warmth spreads. Your headache eases a little. Medieval people, 1. Your liver, 0. Historians still argue whether this worked because of alcohol's pain-dulling properties, or because it simply rehydrated people slightly. Medieval ale wasn't as dehydrating as strong modern drinks, but it certainly didn't help if you overindulged. You step outside slowly, bracing yourself against the bright morning. Other villagers emerge from their homes with similar expressions, squinting, slow, moving, with the caution of people afraid their brains might slosh out. A farmer passes you, holding a clump of herbs. "Fennel," he grunts. "Chew it." You obey. It tastes like licorice and determination. Another remedy. Vinegar diluted in water. Sipping it supposedly strengthened the spirit. You try it. It tastes like the inside of a pickle jar, but it does wake you up. You head toward the marketplace. Each step a delicate negotiation between balance and pain. At a stall, a woman sells honey cakes designed specifically for hangovers. "Sweetness restores the humors," she explains. You eat 1 in 2 bites. It does help. Or maybe you just needed sugar. Medieval science operated heavily in the vibes category. A town doctor, recognizable by his expensive hat and absolutely worrisome confidence, approaches you and offers advice. Eat raw almonds, drink warm water, avoid loud noises, and above all, avoid drunkenness. You nod politely, then immediately ignore all of it. Because no matter how many "don't drink too much" warnings medieval people received, social life revolved around ale. Work days, feast days, holy days, market days, there was always an excuse. And medieval people accepted hangovers as part of the human condition. Just another trial of daily life, like toothaches or stepping in something that definitely used to be a horse. As you walk, a donkey brays loudly beside you. The sound pierces your skull like divine punishment. You crouch, clutching your temples, whispering, "Why?" The donkey stares at you with zero sympathy. Children run past, laughing. Their joy is aggressively loud. You consider outlawing joy in your immediate vicinity. You lean against a wooden fence, breathing slowly, letting the headache fade. And as your senses return, you realize something oddly comforting. Medieval hangovers weren't seen as moral failings. They weren't shameful. They weren't, "You messed up your life last night." They were normal, expected, human. Everyone from farmhands to scholars to monks woke up like this after feast days. And, eventually, like you right now, they recovered. You straighten up, sunlight gentler now, your head slowly clearing. You take a long breath, tasting the cool morning air, and start walking again. Because in medieval Europe, being hungover didn't stop life. It just made everything a little funnier, a little slower, and a lot more relatable. Your head finally stops ringing, the sunlight feels less like a personal attack, and gradually you drift back into the flow of medieval life. And just when you think things are settling, you hear it, the unmistakable roar of a crowd, rhythmic pounding on tables, and a chorus of slurred laughter rolling through the air like thunder wrapped in barley. You follow the noise, because in medieval Europe, this sound means only one thing: drinking games. Yes, long before modern party culture, medieval people were already inventing surprisingly creative and occasionally questionable ways to make alcohol more chaotic. And as you step into a wide courtyard behind a tavern, you find yourself in the middle of a festival night scene where games, challenges, dares, and laughter blend into a kind of joyful, slightly dangerous soup. The first thing you notice: people are already shouting your name, even though they do not know your name. That's how medieval drinking games work. If you're present, you're a participant. A group of men sit around a rough wooden table playing a game called Noddy. It's part card game, part math, part don't spill your drink while pretending you understand the rules. You watch one man slap down a card triumphantly while simultaneously sloshing ale onto his own boots. The table cheers anyway. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval taverns often organized games as a way to keep patrons entertained and spending money. Dice games, card games, and even early board games like tables, a cousin of backgammon, were wildly popular. Gambling was common too, sometimes friendly, sometimes dangerously serious. Laws periodically attempted to ban these activities but failed miserably because medieval humans, much like modern humans, loved doing exactly what they were told not to do. You move toward another group gathered around a large wooden stump. They're playing a game called Hoodman Blind, which is essentially medieval tag, but played blindfolded, and for some reason, drinking is absolutely involved. The blindfolded player stumbles around, arms out, while the others dodge, taunt, and sip. Someone nearly runs straight into a stack of firewood. The crowd screams in delight. It's chaotic, mildly hazardous, and apparently an excellent spectator sport. A quirky tidbit shines through your mind. One drinking game involved chanting rhyming verses. If you messed up the rhyme or stumbled on the words, you drank. If you succeeded, someone else drank. This was medieval poetry night, but with more shouting and significantly less talent. Nearby, two farmers challenge each other to a test of strength that involves lifting a barrel not empty, not full, but filled just enough to be dangerous. One tries first, hoisting it with a growl. The barrel wobbles. The man wobbles. The crowd holds its breath. Then he drops it, barely missing his foot. The courtyard erupts in laughter. "Your turn," someone shouts at you. You politely decline by stepping backwards so quickly, you nearly become part of the wall. At another table, a drinking game is already mid-chaos. It's a simple rule set. Someone asks a riddle. If you get it wrong, drink. If you get it right, you still drink, but smugly. You listen as a man leans in with dramatic flair. What has 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 at night? The crowd groans. They've heard this one. A woman answers immediately. "A man, you fool. Everyone drinks anyway." The Riddler looks personally attacked. Historians still argue whether medieval people invented drinking games independently, across regions, or if they spread organically through trade routes and tavern culture. Records exist of monks playing dice games. Yes, monks again. Soldiers holding drinking contests, nobles playing elaborate competitive drinking at feasts, and even peasants using games to settle disputes. Alcohol was a universal social glue, and games turned that glue into entertainment. You wander toward a small shed-like structure where two men sit with mugs and a set of carved bones dice made from actual animal bones, smooth and worn. They're playing Hazard, a predecessor to modern craps. One man rolls, shouting a prayer to Saint Arnold, patron saint of brewers. The dice land badly. The man sighs, chugs the rest of his ale, and gestures dramatically at the heavens. Clearly, divine intervention has failed him. Further along, children sit watching adults with the same focused curiosity kids have today when witnessing something chaotic but technically allowed. The adults try to impress them by balancing spoons on their noses while drinking. It goes exactly as well as you expect. A bard in the corner strums a fiddle-like instrument while recounting the tale of a man who drank so much he tried to marry a tree. Halfway through the story, someone shouts, "I know who that was." The crowd breaks into giggles. You decide not to investigate further. At one point, you're handed a mug and invited into a game where everyone drinks whenever someone says the word ale. You quickly realize this is a trap. Within minutes, you've had 3 extra sips, and you're now suspicious of every sentence spoken within earshot. You slip away toward a quieter corner, where a group plays a game involving flipping wooden tokens. The goal? Land them upright. The result? They don't. Ever. But each failed attempt is met with laughter and another sip. Someone claims to have seen a token land perfectly once. They are lying. The night grows warmer with lantern light, and the games get louder. Ale sloshes, cheering swells. People hype each other up with medieval shouts of encouragement that sound like a mix between threats and blessings. Someone begins a competitive storytelling game. Everyone takes turns telling one sentence of a story. If your sentence doesn't make sense, you drink. Within 30 seconds, the story involves a goose, a stolen shoe, and a magical loaf of bread with trust issues. Everyone drinks constantly. You laugh into your mug. Games evolve with the night, some energetic, some absurd, some requiring strategy, others requiring absolutely none. But they all share one thing. That warm, unspoken medieval rule that drinking wasn't just about getting drunk. It was about belonging. By the time you finally step away from the games, your cheeks ache from smiling. Your steps are steady enough barely, but your heart feels full and warm. The laughter still echoes behind you, drifting through the night like a soft, happy hum. Because in a world where life was hard and unpredictable, medieval people found joy in the most human thing of all, a silly game, a shared drink, and a moment of pure, uncomplicated togetherness. You drift away from the courtyard games, still hearing echoes of laughter, and move toward a quieter part of town, where the smell shifts from yeasty ale to something richer, fruitier, deeper. Because while peasants spent their lives sipping cloudy ales and unpredictable herbal brews, the wealthy drank something very different. And tonight, you get to experience the drink medieval elites adored, flaunted, and sometimes absolutely abused, wine. You step through the wooden gates of a manor house, greeted by the glow of lanterns and the murmur of controlled, dignified conversation, the kind people only maintain before they've had too much to drink. A servant in clean linen leads you to a hall where long tables sit beneath heavy rafters blackened by centuries of smoke. The air smells of roasted meat, beeswax, candles, and wine so fragrant you can practically taste it before it reaches your lips. Nobles lounge on carved chairs. Their clothing glitters with embroidery, metalwork, and dyes peasants could never afford. But what they treasure most tonight isn't the clothing or the food, or even the music drifting softly from a small ensemble in the corner. It's the wine. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europe produced vast quantities of wine, especially in regions like France, Italy, and the Germanic lands. But even in places where vineyards were scarce, nobles imported barrels from abroad. Wine wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of status, refinement, and sophistication. If ale was life, wine was luxury. A steward pours you a cup of deep red wine from a ceramic pitcher. You swirl it, And unlike ale, it actually swirls smooth, clear, shimmering in the firelight. You take a cautious sip. It's good. In fact, it's incredibly good. Sweet, but not cloying. Earthy, with hints of spices added during storage. And just like that, you understand why nobles kept cellars full of this stuff. You also understand why they spent entire evenings debating which region produced the finest flavors, using terms like robust and vibrant centuries before modern sommeliers did. Across the table, two knights argue about the best vineyards near Bordeaux. One slams his fist on the table, swearing his supplier knows exactly when to harvest. The other rolls his eyes, muttering something about unripe swill. Their wives sip politely, while exchanging the exhausted look of people who have heard this exact argument at least 400 times. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind. Medieval nobles sometimes mixed wine with honey, spices, herbs, or even warm water to create mulled beverages for winter nights. One popular version, called hippocras, was believed to have medicinal properties. People served it at weddings, feasts, and celebrations, basically any event where nobles wanted to sound cultured while slowly getting plastered. Nearby, a group of monks visiting the manor nurse their own goblets of wine. One wipes his lips and looks slightly guilty. Another looks slightly too pleased. Wine had a place in religious ritual? Sure, but monks enjoying it socially? Absolutely. Moderation was encouraged. Perfection was rare. Historians still argue whether medieval nobles were genuinely refined drinkers or simply enjoyed the excuse to indulge behind polite etiquette. Records show both sides. Some noble households strictly limited drinking to maintain dignity, while others threw feasts so wild that chroniclers described guests crawling under tables or being carried out by servants. You sip again, letting the warmth bloom in your chest. Unlike ale, which feels like it slides down with a grainy thump, wine flows smoothly, wrapping your senses in a gentle haze. You wander toward the high table, where the lord and lady of the manor sit beside honored guests. Servants pour wine freely, careful not to spill a drop. This stuff is imported, expensive, and treasured like liquid crown jewels. The lord raises his cup and toasts to alliances, prosperity, and the hope that the king doesn't raise taxes again. Everyone nods solemnly. The lady toasts to good harvests, safe journeys, and strong children. Everyone nods again. Then someone toasts to the wine itself. Everyone nods with great enthusiasm. A steward uncorks a second jug, this one white wine, and everyone pretends to compare flavors. In truth, half of them don't care. They're already warm, tipsy, and riding the early stages of noble confidence. Another cup? A servant asks. You hesitate, but the servant smiles knowingly, because hesitation is not a medieval noble virtue. You accept. The hall grows louder. Laughter spills across the tables. Someone begins reciting poetry terribly. A lady interrupts with a story about her cousin who drank so much hippocras one winter that he tried to ride a pig home, believing it was his horse. A bard in the corner sings about grape harvests with such dramatic intensity you suspect he's never actually seen a grape. Meanwhile, at the far end of the hall, a quiet scholar gently debates the medicinal qualities of wine. He claims it warms the blood, comforts the stomach, and clarifies the mind. This is interesting, because he is currently slurring those words. Medieval physicians wrote entire treatises on wine, its effects, its recommended uses, its temperament, according to the four humours. Some wines were believed to soothe melancholy. Others supposedly sparked creativity. Others still were considered dangerous because they heated the body too much, potentially inflaming sinful thoughts. You sip and think, yep, I can see how they got there. As the night stretches on, you wander into a stone cellar beneath the manor. Rows of barrels line the walls, stacked neatly on wooden racks. This is wealth. Real wealth. A single barrel might cost more than a peasant earned in months. Wine cellars were symbols of elite identity, a place to show off, brag quietly, and store the liquid prestige that helped maintain social rank. You return to the hall just in time to see a nobleman stand, wobble slightly, and raise his cup for a final toast of the night. To good wine, good company, and waking up tomorrow slightly less miserable than we deserve. Cheers erupt. You raise your cup with them. Because in medieval Europe, Wine wasn't just what the wealthy drank, it was how they performed their identity, how they socialized, bonded, bragged, flirted, negotiated, and relaxed. Ale kept you alive. Wine let you feel alive. You leave the manor hall warm, slightly flushed, and carrying the lingering sweetness of noble wine on your tongue. The night is cool. Torches flicker. Your footsteps echo softly against cobblestones, still damp with the memory of recent rain. But as you wander toward the edge of town, a different scent reaches you, sharper than ale, richer than wine, unmistakably potent. Something new has arrived in medieval Europe. Something that confuses physicians, excites merchants, terrifies clergy, and absolutely does not care about your tolerance level. Distilled spirits. You follow the smell into a small workshop set behind a merchant's house. Inside, the air is thick with warm vapor and the faint metallic tang of heated copper. A strange contraption sits on a table, coils, pots, and pipes fused together like someone tried to build a dragon using kitchenware. A man in a soot-streaked apron beams with pride. "Behold," he says, "the alembic." The alembic, an early distillation. The device isn't new to the world, but in medieval Europe, it's only now beginning to trickle from alchemists' workshops into taverns, households, and eventually medical practices. And the stuff it makes? Stronger, sharper, meaner, and far more dangerous than anything medieval people have tasted before. A mainstream historical fact. Distilled spirits began spreading through medieval Europe between the 12th and 14th centuries, first as medicines prepared by monks and physicians, then as curiosities traded along merchant routes, and eventually as beverages. These early spirits weren't vodka or whiskey as we know them. They were crude, fiery liquids, often called aqua vitae, meaning the water of life. You take a cautious sniff of the clear liquid the merchant offers you. It smells like it wants to fight you. You sip anyway. Instant regret, instant warmth, instant clarity about why medieval people were so confused by this invention. It hits your throat like a flaming arrow. Your eyes water, your ears buzz. Your soul briefly leaves your body to fill out a complaint form. The merchant laughs. Strong, yes? Stout enough to wake a corpse. You nod, mostly because you cannot speak. He tells you proudly that scholars claim aqua vitae can preserve youth, cure diseases, lift the spirit, sharpen the mind, and even prolong life. Medieval physicians wrote entire treatises praising it as a miracle tonic. They applied it to wounds, mixed it with herbs, and drank it in cautious medicinal doses. Cautious doses. Not whatever that sip was. A quirky tidbit drifts through your mind. When spirits first appeared in Europe, many people believed they carried the essence of whatever they were distilled from: wine, grain, fruit. They thought the act of distillation concentrated not only flavor and alcohol, but also spiritual or medicinal qualities. Some even thought spirits trapped the soul of the material. This led to all kinds of wild experimentation. You picture a medieval alchemist staring into his alembic, whispering, "Soon, I shall capture the soul of this barley." He probably did. You regain your senses just enough to notice a few other curious items in the workshop. Small jars of herbs meant to flavor the distilled liquid, experimental fruits soaking in glass vessels, and a ledger full of notes that looked like someone wrote them while drunk and being chased. "Want another taste?" the merchant asks. You step back like he just offered you a cursed relic. He shrugs and pours some into a small flask for a passing traveler, a wiry man with the look of someone who sleeps more on roadsides than in beds. The traveler takes one swig, shakes his head violently like a wet dog, and hands over 2 coins. "Good for cold nights," he mutters. Historians still argue whether early spirits were actually consumed recreationally or mostly used medicinally in the earliest centuries of distillation. Evidence suggests both. In some places, spirits remained expensive, rare, and associated with healing. In others, taverns began offering mysterious, fiery drinks that left patrons wide-eyed and thoroughly confused about why their legs suddenly forgot how to behave. You leave the workshop and head toward the docks, because another truth emerges as soon as spirits enter Europe. Imports explode. Mediterranean traders bring in fiery, grape-based spirits. Northern merchants trade fruit distillations. Farther east, stronger, stranger liquids arrive in small barrels tied to camel caravans. And everywhere these drinks appear, they spark the same reaction. What is this? Why does it burn? Give me more. Sailors especially fall in love with spirits. Cheap, strong, and stable, they last longer on voyages than ale and take up less space. A single barrel of distilled liquor contains the punch of many barrels of ale. Captains realize this instantly. So do pirates. And suddenly, seafaring becomes significantly rowdier. You sit by the water, watching men load cargo onto a ship. One worker takes a swig from a flask, coughs dramatically, then grins. Aqua vitae, he tells you proudly, keeps the sea demons away. Absolutely no part of that sentence inspires confidence. Behind you, a group of merchants argues over whether distilled drinks should be taxed differently. One insists spirits are medicinal and should be exempt. Another argues they are dangerously strong and should be regulated. The third simply says, I drank a cup last night and woke up speaking Latin. Or maybe I dreamt that. The debate grows so heated that one of them spills his cup, and the liquid instantly makes a small wooden crate smell like a pharmacy and a bonfire had a child. You watch as a priest walks by, shaking his head disapprovingly. Clergy were deeply uneasy about spirits. Wine had a sacred role in Christian ritual. Ale had centuries of acceptance. But distilled liquor? Too strong, too potent, too unpredictable. Some called it the devil's water. Others reluctantly admitted it had medical value, but should be used carefully. You sip a little more, only a little, and feel that strange clarity again, like your mind sharpens while your body softens. It's unsettling, fascinating, a little magical, and more intoxicating than anything you've tasted so far. Medieval people felt the same. This new drink didn't just join the world of ale and wine, it disrupted it. It created new rituals, new dangers, new pleasures, new policies, new problems. And as the night deepens, you realize you're standing at the dawn of a new era in medieval drinking culture. A world where what being drunk feels like is about to change forever. You tuck the memory of the burning sip into your mind, feeling a strange warmth glow inside you. Aqua vitae, water of life, and sometimes water of absolute chaos. You leave the docks behind with that strange, fiery warmth from distilled spirits still humming through your chest. And now the night carries you toward one of medieval Europe's greatest spectacles, places where drinking wasn't a casual pastime or even a lively tavern hobby, but a requirement, a cultural expectation, a full-body commitment. Feasts. You hear them before you see them. Drums, laughter, clattering plates, the unmistakable roar of 100 people talking at once, punctuated by the occasional whoop of someone who has absolutely misjudged their tolerance. You step into the glow of torches and oil lamps, and there it is, a manor courtyard overflowing with tables, benches, food, musicians, and, most importantly, barrels of ale and wine stacked like glorious wooden mountains. The smell hits you first. Roasted meats, fresh bread, herbs, smoke, and that sweet sour scent of alcohol being poured in quantities that would terrify a modern bartender. You take in the scene, your senses soaking it in. Because tonight, you're not simply observing a medieval feast. You're stepping right into the mayhem. A servant hands you a cup the moment you cross the threshold. You don't ask what it is. In medieval feasts, you never ask. You just drink it and brace for impact. The hall is buzzing. Men and women sit shoulder to shoulder, plates piled high, mugs constantly being refilled. The host, a noble with a beard that could legally be classified as a weapon, stands proudly at the head table, raising his cup in greeting. He's already rosy-cheeked. You suspect this feast started hours ago. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval feasts were central to social life. They weren't just meals, they were political theatres, social negotiations, displays of wealth, and elaborate PR campaigns. Feasts forged alliances, sealed marriages, rewarded loyalty, and showed off the host's ability to provide abundance. And abundance meant alcohol. Lots of it. You sit at a long wooden table beside a baker, a knight, and a nervous-looking scribe who keeps checking, his ink like it's going to run away. The knight slams his mug down before introducing himself, and the baker cheerfully hands you a slice of something steaming and delicious. "First time at a feast?" the knight asks. You nod. He grins. "Good. Pace yourself." Or don't. Up to you. Not reassuring. A minstrel's troupe begins a lively tune. Strings, drums, flutes, all woven together into a rhythm that makes your foot tap involuntarily. People cheer. Someone stands on his bench, thrusting his cup into the air, and shouts, "To our host." Everyone else echoes it with escalating enthusiasm. As mugs are lifted, you notice servers weaving through tables with large pitchers, refilling cups before they're even empty. That's intentional. Medieval drinking wasn't about sipping carefully, it was about constant, communal momentum. If you hesitated, someone filled your cup for you. Occupied hands meant no awkwardness, no hesitation. Just flow. Your cup is refilled. You sip. It's wine. Rich, warm, sweetened with spices, probably cinnamon or cloves, and heated just enough to slip down like silk. You sigh contentedly. The scribe beside you sighs too, but his sounds like existential dread. He's on his third cup, and his handwriting has already devolved into what looks like ancient runes. Food keeps arriving. Roasted boar, venison stew, spiced fowl, loaves of bread, trays of cheese, trenchers piled high with vegetables. But honestly, people are drinking more than they're eating. Medieval etiquette books gently scolded guests not to overdrink, but those same books also warned that refusing drinks could insult the host. A paradox designed to guarantee everyone gets at least moderately drunk. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some medieval feasts featured drinking horns, massive ceremonial vessels passed around the table. If you accepted the horn, you had to finish it. If you refused, you risked being mocked or accused of cowardice. Imagine a peer pressure device shaped like a large animal horn. That's your night now. Sure enough, a horn the size of a baby goat is handed to you. The knight grins. The baker claps. The scribe whispers, "May God guide you." You drink. It's tart and surprisingly smooth, but the sheer volume makes your eyes water. The table cheers. You survive. Historians still argue whether medieval feasts were genuinely chaotic or if chroniclers exaggerated for dramatic effect. Some accounts describe orderly, dignified meals. Others describe drunken dancers falling into fireplaces, nobles wrestling in the courtyard, and people waking up in pig pens wearing someone else's boots. Considering human nature, the truth probably lies somewhere in the muddled, wine-soaked middle. The music shifts into a faster tune. People stand, dance, link arms, spin, stomp, and occasionally fall over. You join a circle dance, unsure of the steps, but fully embraced by the group's chaotic enthusiasm. At one point, a woman spins too hard and launches her shoe across the hall. It narrowly misses the noble host, who just laughs louder. A storyteller stands on a bench and recounts the tale of a king who drank so much mead he accidentally knighted a turnip. The crowd roars. Someone slams the table. Someone else hiccups so violently the bard stops mid-verse. Every few minutes, a servant refills your cup without asking. You try to cover it. They dodge your hand like cup-refilling ninjas. You accept your fate. As the feast deepens into the night, competitions begin. Who can drink the fastest? Who can stay upright, longest? Who can tell the funniest exaggerated hunting story? Who can sing the loudest without passing out? You watch as a man confidently starts singing a ballad. His voice cracks on the second line. He collapses onto his friend's shoulder. The crowd cheers like he won anyway. Candles burn low. The hall grows warm. Laughter swells. The host stands again and proposes one final toast, this one quieter, more heartfelt. To companions, he says, to warmth, to life. Everyone raises their cups. You raise yours too, feeling a soft tug in your chest, because that's the truth behind medieval feasts. Drinking wasn't about losing control. It was about togetherness, community, relief, celebration in a world that offered very little comfort. As the music softens and people drift towards sleep, heads on tables, backs against walls, feet still tapping faintly, you step outside into the cool night, the echo of joy still humming in your ears. And you realize, moderation died at medieval feasts, but friendship thrived. You step away from the echoing music of the feast, breath still warm with spice and wine, and wander toward a quieter edge of the manor grounds. The night feels cooler here, calmer, almost contemplative, which is fitting. because the next piece of this journey takes you somewhere far more complicated than taverns or feasts. You're drifting toward the church. Not the grand political church with crowns and councils, but the everyday medieval church, the stone parish down the road, the small chapel in the market square, the monastery you visited earlier where religion shaped daily life as firmly as bread, work, and weather. And if there's one relationship medieval Europe struggled to define, it was the one between faith and alcohol. The church's stance wasn't simple. It wasn't even stable. It wobbled like a tipsy pilgrim trying to walk a straight line. You arrive outside a modest church as dawn begins to pale the horizon. The wooden door creaks open, and a priest steps out, rubbing his temples like someone who was definitely called out of bed earlier than desired. He nods at you with the expression that is both solemn and faintly hungover. A mainstream historical fact. Alcohol was absolutely central to Christian ritual. Wine held sacred significance in the Eucharist. Monasteries brewed ale as part of daily life and hospitality duties. Pilgrims drank wine and ale on journeys because they were safer than water. Clergy consumed alcohol regularly, but were expected to do so respectfully. Keyword, expected. Reality, messier. The priest gestures for you to come inside, so you step onto cold stone floors, still etched with candle soot and centuries of footsteps. The church smells faintly of wax, incense, and the lingering sweetness of last night's liturgical wine. You kneel beside a pew while he sets about lighting a lamp, and you can't help noticing he does it very slowly, like someone timing the act with his heartbeat. Long night? You ask softly. He sighs. There was a wedding. That explains everything. Medieval weddings were feasts in disguise. He sits beside you, robes rustling. We tell people to practice moderation, he says. And yet, life is harsh. Drink gives comfort. We cannot condemn comfort. This, right here, is the heart of medieval contradiction. The church preached moderation, sobriety, and self-control. But it also recognized that daily life was difficult, laborious, dangerous, and relentlessly unstable. Alcohol soothed, united, healed, helped people through grief, sickness, and fear. So, for centuries, the church didn't try to abolish drinking, it tried to manage it. A quirky tidbit floats up. Some religious orders had extremely specific drinking regulations. For example, monks were sometimes allotted a daily ration of ale measured in pints, with adjustments for feast days, fasting seasons, illness, or hard labor. In one abbey, monks were given half a gallon a day. Half a gallon. You look around at the quiet stone walls. These men prayed 6 times a day, copied manuscripts, tended gardens, brewed beer. How they didn't float away on a permanent cloud of barley-scented haze is one of history's smaller miracles. Historians still argue whether clerical drunkenness was a widespread issue or exaggerated by critics, some surviving. Records show bishops issuing strict warnings against priests who drank too much at funerals. Others show monks stumbling into evening prayers with suspiciously pink cheeks. Some medieval moralists complained constantly about wine-soaked priests, while other records rarely mention the issue at all. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Most clergy were sensible, some overindulged, and everyone pretended it wasn't happening unless it became a problem. The priest beside you rises and begins preparing the altar for morning mass. The chalice gleams. The wine is ready, a deep red, stored carefully to avoid spoilage. During mass, this wine becomes symbolic, sacred. But outside of ritual, it was also just wine. People drank the same stuff with dinner, and medieval parish priests lived among normal people, not in separate palaces. They attended celebrations, funerals, gatherings. People pressed cups into their hands constantly. Refusing could be rude, so most priests navigated a delicate tightrope between spiritual leadership and social participation. You follow him out the back door into a tiny enclosed garden. Herbs crowd the beds: mint, thyme, hyssop, rue, and rosemary. Some were used for cooking, others for medicine, others still for flavoring wine or ale in medicinal preparations. He picks a sprig of mint and crushes it between his fingers. For headaches, he murmurs, handing it to you. You sniff it. It smells refreshing. Your head, still carrying faint echoes from last night's feast, appreciates the gesture. You ask him how he feels about the arrival of distilled spirits. His face tightens. Too strong, he says. Too sharp. Too quick to inflame the passions. Then, after a moment, but useful. In medicine. Ah, yes. The classic medieval theological stance. Possibly sinful. Definitely effective. Use with caution. He shows you a small storeroom where bottles and flasks line the shelves. Some contain wine. Others hold herbal tinctures. One flask, he warns, contains early aquavitae. A healer's tool, he says, not something to be handed out freely. Yet he looks at it with the exact expression monks had earlier, the expression of someone who absolutely understands its appeal. You leave the church garden and walk back toward the town. The sun climbs. People begin their day, workers hauling tools, women carrying baskets, children chasing chickens in ways that should violate physics. And among them, you notice two monks from a nearby abbey walking calmly through the square. Each carries a jug. Not a suspicious one, just a normal vessel, probably holding ale for their journey. Nobody reacts. Nobody judges. Because despite its moral warnings, the church didn't condemn alcohol. It helped regulate it, shape it, moderate excess, encourage gratitude over gluttony. And in many places, it was the church that brewed the cleanest, safest, most reliable ale available. The contradiction wasn't a failure. It was a reflection of medieval life itself, messy, human, imperfect, and filled with people doing their best to find balance between hardship and comfort. You pause at the edge of the marketplace as bells ring for morning prayer, and the last thought settles into your mind like a warm sip of wine. The church tried to guide souls, but it also had to guide drinkers, and neither task was simple. You wander away from the churchyard, the priest's voice still echoing softly in your mind, and drift back into the hum of medieval daily life. Market stalls open, bakers haul warm loaves onto wooden tables, blacksmiths hammer metal with the rhythm of someone who hasn't had a hangover since 1327. And moving among all these familiar sights is a group you haven't spent enough time with. Yet the women who shaped medieval drinking culture far more than history books ever admitted, because while taverns were rowdy and monasteries were orderly and nobles drank ceremonially, the backbone of medieval brewing, the everyday brewer, the person who kept households hydrated, taverns stocked, and entire villages from spiraling into dysentery-fueled chaos. Women. You step into a narrow lane where smoke curls lazily from chimneys, and the air smells faintly of boiling mash. It's coming from a small timber house where an alewife, linen cap tied tight, apron flour-dusted, stands in her doorway, stirring a bubbling vat with a wooden paddle longer than your arm. She sees you, nods, then gestures you closer with the authority of someone who has brewed more batches this week than you've had full meals. A mainstream historical fact. For centuries, brewing was considered women's work. It fit into the household economy alongside bread making, butter churning, and textile work. Brewing wasn't glamorous. It wasn't prestigious. It was labor. Skilled, essential labor. Women brewed for their families, for their neighbors, for sale, for travelers, and sometimes for the entire town. Inside her home, the air is humid and grain-scented. Stones warm the vat from below. Children run between your legs. A cat sleeps dangerously close to the mash bucket. It's chaos, but productive chaos, the kind that kept medieval communities alive. And here's where it gets interesting. The alewife wipes her brow. Want to taste? She asks. You do. The ale is warm, cloudy, slightly sweet, with faint herbal bitterness. Not sophisticated, not refined, but good, comforting, in a raw, honest way. She grins. First run will be ready by sundown. Her confidence radiates. She knows her craft. She knows the entire neighborhood will knock on her door tonight. And she knows exactly how strong this batch is, something even professional taverns struggle to judge. But despite their skill, alewives were often targets of suspicion. A quirky tidbit floats to the surface of your mind. Some signs of an alewife's business, like the broomstick on the door, cats to control mice, tall pointed hats, worn for visibility in markets, later contributed to the iconography of witches. Not because these women practiced magic, but but because they practiced independence. Medieval society didn't always love independent women. You step back outside into the lane and see another group of women selling ale from wicker baskets filled with small clay cups. They move confidently, pouring drinks for workers heading to the fields, laughing with them, gossiping loudly enough to drown out a rooster who is clearly having a crisis nearby. These women are brewers, vendors, economists, social centres. And then there were the tavern women, female tavern keepers who ran bustling, noisy establishments without husbands. You pass one now, a sturdy woman with a ladle in one hand, a smirk on her face, and the demeanour of someone who could silence an army with a single eyebrow lift. She stands at her doorway, overseeing her lively tavern with the calm of a seasoned general. Historians still argue whether female-run taverns were more common in towns or in rural areas. Records show both. Some towns welcomed alewives. Others tried regulating them harshly. Some guilds let women join. Others pushed them out as brewing became more profitable. But the truth? Women brewed. Women sold. Women drank too. You head inside her tavern, where a group of women sits around a table, spinners, weavers, washerwomen sharing a communal jug of ale. Their laughter fills the room, deep and unrestrained. A few men sit nearby, listening but not intruding. There's a comfort here, a safety that doesn't always exist in the men-dominated taverns across town. The tavern keeper pours you a mug. "On the house, if you tell me a good story," she says. You sit, sip, and feel the atmosphere shift. This is a different kind of tavern. No brawling, no shouting, no posturing. Just conversation stories about pregnancies, lost chickens, winter preparations, petty rivalries, and the eternal struggle of dealing with stubborn husbands. One woman rolls her eyes. "He drank too much last week and tried to milk a goat that wasn't ours." Another sighs. "At least your goat didn't chase him." A third admits she once got so drunk she sang loudly at the town, well until someone bribed her with bread to stop. They roar with laughter. You join them. It feels like the world shrinks into a warm, safe circle of soft voices and ale-sweetened honesty. Women also drank privately after long days of work, during childbirth recovery, at gatherings, or simply to unwind. Household accounts mention wine purchased specifically for women's use. Medical manuals recommended ale for menstrual pain. Even midwives used alcohol to calm nerves, sterilize tools, or help mothers relax during difficult labors. But as women gained economic power through brewing, suspicion grew. Men worried about competition. Authorities worried about taxation. Church officials worried about improper influence. And thus began the slow shift. As brewing became more profitable, men moved in, guilds formed, monasteries expanded production, regulations doubled, women were pushed out of what had been their domain, but not before shaping centuries of drinking culture. You finish your mug. The tavern keeper smiles warmly. "You're welcome back any time," she says, patting your shoulder. You step into the sunlight again, feeling a softness in your chest. Not from the ale, though that helps, but from the realization that medieval drinking wasn't just an ale-drenched world of men. It was a world built, sustained, and flavored by women. Women who brewed, women who sold, women who drank, women who laughed, women who resisted, women who survived. And as you walk down the lane, listening to their voices fade behind you, you understand something deeply. To understand medieval drinking, you must understand the women who kept the cups full. You leave the women's laughter behind and step into the open air again, where the sky has softened into that gentle medieval afternoon light. Golden but not bright, warm but not scorching. The day feels slower now, the way late hours always do after a morning of work and a midday mug of ale. You wander along a dirt path that winds between houses, fields, and granaries, and you start to notice something fundamental about medieval life. People didn't drink the same way every day. They drank according to the seasons. In a world without refrigerators, climate control, imported produce, or supermarkets, the rhythm of the year dictated everything. Work, sleep, diet, and drinking habits. You take a slow breath and feel yourself easing into that rhythm, step by step. A mainstream historical fact: Alcohol consumption rose and fell dramatically depending on the time of year. Harvest season brought feasting and heavy drinking. Winter brought quiet evenings and the last precious stores of ale. Spring sometimes meant diluted or sour brews because supplies ran low. Festivals, fast days, weather patterns, and agricultural cycles shaped what and how much people drank. You walk past a granary where workers are hauling sacks of barley. It's harvest season, the air is dusty, warm, alive. This is the time when brewing picks up speed because grain is plentiful, days are long, nights still warm enough for fermentation, and everyone's in a good mood. Harvest meant fresh ale, strong ale, even experimental batches spiced with herbs and honey. You watch a pair of women hauling grain past you and hear one say, "This year's brew will be strong." The other grins. She knows exactly what that means for the next village festival. And the festivals, oh, the festivals. You hear music as you approach the village square. Children run in circles, chasing one another, while adults set up tables for a feast. This isn't a holiday you recognize, but medieval Europe had dozens saints' days, harvest days, solstices, marriages, regional fairs, market celebrations, guild anniversaries. And nearly all of them involved drinking. Not let's have a glass or two, but let's celebrate until the stars look like spinning lanterns. Then the seasons shift. You picture winter creeping in, cold, hungry, dark, where sunrise is late and sunset is aggressive. People huddle indoors with the last of their ale, brewed weeks ago. Winter ale could be stronger, thicker, heartier, because cold slowed spoilage. You see yourself wrapped in wool, sharing a small cup of warm spiced ale by the hearth, savouring each sip because supplies won't be replenished until the next brewing day. A quirky tidbit: some households brewed Yule ale specifically for winter solstice celebrations. It was heavily flavoured, special, and sometimes blessed for good luck. People drank it during long winter nights to stay warm or to feel warm, which was close enough. But the year wasn't kind to drinkers in spring. By March or April, ale supplies often turned sour. The temperature swings made fermentation unpredictable. Barrels leaked. Winter batches lost strength. Medieval people sometimes drank watery ale that tasted like fermented cardboard, or at least what you imagine medieval cardboard would taste like. You walk past a barrel maker's workshop where a cooper taps gently on fresh oak staves. He tells you that spring is when repairs matter most. One bad barrel can ruin a family's entire ale supply. Because of that, people sometimes drank less in spring, not out of piety, but because they physically couldn't produce more. Historians still argue whether medieval people had regular, dry spells between brewing cycles, or whether communities simply adapted by switching to weaker, hastier brews. The truth likely varies by region. In grain-rich areas, people brewed steadily. In harsher regions, the year felt like a drinking roller coaster, from abundance to scarcity and back again. As you follow the path into a field, you see labourers working under the late afternoon sun. Their jugs sit nearby under a patch of shade, probably filled with small ale. Workdays required hydration, but the summer heat made strong ale risky. You take a small sip from a cup offered by a friendly shepherd. It's refreshing light, slightly sweet, almost like barley tea, perfect for long hours in the sun. Then, if you imagine autumn again, long shadows, cool breezes, early evenings, and freshly brewed seasonal ale bubbling in backyard tubs. Workers raise cups after the final harvest sheaf is cut. There's a collective exhale across the countryside, a shared relief that winter grain supplies look promising. In autumn, drinking is celebratory, joyful, earned. In winter, drinking is survival. In spring, drinking is rationing. In summer, drinking is moderation, or as close to moderation as medieval people ever got. You approach a wayside shrine where candles flicker in the breeze. A woman leaves a small cup of ale as an offering for a local saint. Another tradition, alcohol wasn't just for people. It was woven into spiritual and communal rituals. Weddings in June had specific drinking customs. Harvest festivals in autumn had others. Even funerals had seasonal variations in what was served. The year guided everything. You sit on a low stone wall, watching farmers carry in the last of the day's harvest. Their shoulders sag, but their spirits rise when someone lifts a jug and calls out, "To the evening." Everyone takes a small sip, not to get drunk, not yet. Just to mark the moment, to acknowledge another day done, another season turning, another year looping slowly forward. The shepherd beside you takes a seat and explains that his father always said, "Drink with the sun. Stronger drinks in winter, weaker drinks in summer. Morning ale to start work, midday ale to keep going, evening ale to unwind, festival ale to celebrate, Sunday ale to rest, distilled spirits for sickness, or special courage." Each drink belonged to its place in the year, like notes in a long, slow agricultural song. You take another sip of the shepherd's ale. It tastes different now, not just a drink, but a moment in the calendar. A clue about the season, a memory of the land. And as the sun dips lower, painting the world in gold, you finally understand medieval drinking wasn't random. It was a rhythm, a cycle, a calendar written in barley, grapes, honey, and herbs. Every sip was a conversation with the time of year. And tonight, you're drinking right on schedule. You rise from the stone wall and drift back toward the town just as the daylight softens into that dusky blue hour when shadows lengthen, torches sputter awake, and the entire medieval world seems to hum with a quiet, watchful tension. It's the hour when the workers head home, the taverns warm up, and the stories begin. The stories of what happens when drinking goes sideways. Because tonight, you're stepping into a world where ale and wine don't just fuel laughter and feasts, they also fuel trouble. And medieval justice had a very particular way of dealing with alcohol-fueled chaos. The first thing you notice is the shouting. Not angry shouting yet, but the kind of raised voices that teeter between fun and disaster. Two men argue in the narrow lane outside a baker's shop, gesturing wildly with half-empty jugs. One insists the other owes him a chicken. The other insists he does not. Neither remembers the full story. A constable stands nearby, arms crossed. He looks exhausted. You get the sense that medieval law enforcement wasn't designed to handle sober disputes, let alone fermented ones. A mainstream historical fact, medieval courts were full of alcohol-related offences. Drunken brawls, drunken insults, drunken accidents, drunken property damage, drunken, "I thought that horse was mine," drunken, "I thought that wife was mine," and your personal favourite drunken attempts to climb buildings for no sensible reason. Records from England, France, and Germany show countless petty crimes directly tied to drinking. The constable shakes his head, steps forward, and separates the men with the skill of someone who has done this 4 times today. "Settle it tomorrow," he says, "when your heads work." That was common medieval wisdom. Sober, decisions tomorrow. Drunk chaos tonight. You keep walking, following the lantern-lit lane toward the town square. A crowd has gathered around a wooden platform where a man sits on the ground rubbing his ankle. He apparently tried to jump over a vendor's cart after just one too many at the tavern. The cart lost a wheel. He lost his dignity. The vendor lost her temper. The town reeve steps forward, examining the scene with a sigh. Medieval officials were often unpaid or poorly paid, which meant they dealt with this chaos mostly out of civic duty, not joy. He listens to the vendor, watches the man fail to stand straight, and declares the penalty. The man must repair the cart tomorrow and pay a small fine. Justice delivered. Mild, practical, embarrassing. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind. Medieval courts sometimes used the drunkard's cloak as punishment. The offender, usually male, was forced to wear a giant barrel with holes cut out for the arms and head, then paraded through town so everyone could admire their poor life choices. Nothing says, "Learn your lesson," like being dressed as a human keg. You wander deeper into the square, where 2 women sit on a bench chatting while watching people pass. One points at a man stumbling out of the tavern. "That'll be trouble," she says. "Wasn't he the one who set the hay cart on fire last winter?" The other asks. "No, that was the miller." "Ah, yes." They nod knowingly. Medieval towns had memories like elephants. If you did something stupid while drunk, the whole community filed it under very important law. You continue toward a small stone building, the local court hall. Its heavy wooden door is open just enough for candlelight to spill onto the street. Curious, you peek inside. A magistrate sits at a table, going through a stack of parchment complaints. A clerk with ink-stained fingers reads them aloud. Item: John Miller, accused of striking Thomas Carter with a fish. The magistrate groans. Arl again? Most assuredly, my lord. Fine him a penny for the fish, and tell him to apologize. Another parchment. Item: Margaret Fletcher accused of calling her neighbour a goat-faced devil. The magistrate squints. Was she drunk? The clerk hesitates. We believe so. She also tried to sell her shoes to a passing monk. The magistrate leans back. Warn her. No fine. Tell her to keep the shoes. Historians still argue whether medieval courts were strict or lenient with drunken offenders. Some regions had harsh penalties. Others treated drunkenness as an unfortunate but normal hazard of life. Many courts punished the effects rather than the drinking itself. Violence, damage, slander, accidental fires, or disturbing the peace. You wander outside again and find a group of men gathered near the stocks. A young man sits inside, not for a major crime, but for drunkenly shouting obscenities at the town bell ringer. The bell ringer is, standing nearby, arms folded, looking very smug. A woman passes by and scolds him lightly. Your mother will hear of this, she says. He groans. Not because of the stocks, but because that's worse. Kids throw soft apples at him, the medieval equivalent of gentle teasing. Stocks weren't always cruel punishments. Often they were meant to embarrass the offender long enough to make them think twice next time. Not that it always worked. A drunken brawl erupts near a tavern entrance, a small one, mostly shoving and heated nonsense about somebody's brother's debt involving sheep. The tavern keeper storms out, apron flapping like a war banner. He breaks up the fight with a single shout. Tavern keepers, you realize, were unofficial law enforcement. If fights happened on their premises or doorsteps, they could be fined. So they had strong personal motivation to prevent chaos. Save it for the morning, the tavern keeper growls. The men instantly disperse. You step back into the street and find yourself walking beside an older woman carrying a basket of herbs. She gives you a patient smile. Night brings foolishness, she says. Drink brings courage. The two do not mix. You nod. She's basically explained all of medieval crime in one sentence. As night deepens, you see torches flicker along the town walls. The watchmen begin their rounds. They're not looking for burglars, not primarily. They're looking for drunkards wandering too close to open flames, falling into ditches, or trying to ride livestock home. One watchman sees you observing him and shrugs. Nights are quiet unless someone's had too much, he says. But that's most nights. Sometimes medieval justice was harsh, sometimes lenient, sometimes absurd. But one truth resonates as you watch the last brawl dissolve into laughter. Most alcohol-fueled crimes weren't real crimes. They were human moments, messy, impulsive, foolish, forgiven. Because medieval life was already hard. And no one wanted to punish a neighbor for needing a little too much escape. You leave the town square behind, the murmur of drunken quarrels fading into the night as you wander toward the outskirts where the road stretches out under moonlight, dusty and quiet. It's here, outside the walls, that a different kind of drinking life reveals itself. Not feast nights, not tavern chaos, not noble ceremony, but travel. Because medieval Europe wasn't still. People moved: pilgrims, merchants, peddlers, soldiers, minstrels, messengers, farmers, sailors, and nearly all of them travelled with the same liquid companion sloshing gently at their hip: ale, wine, or increasingly, spirits. What was it like being tipsy or even just buzzed while travelling long, dangerous, unpredictable medieval roads? Tonight, you'll find out. You follow a rutted path lined with hedges and wobbling fence posts. Your boots crunch softly on gravel. Up ahead, a fire flickers beside the road, and you spot a small group of travellers gathered beneath an oak tree. They're sharing a jug, passing it clockwise in the universal medieval gesture of "Welcome, stranger." You approach slowly. One of them, a merchant with a patched cloak and a smile big enough to hide his missing teeth, offers you the jug. You take a cautious sip. It's strong ale. Very strong. You immediately understand why his group is so cheerful, despite camping in what is essentially a ditch. A mainstream historical fact. Travellers of all kinds drank heavily during journeys, not only because water was unsafe, but because alcohol dulled fear, pain, boredom, and sometimes the cold. Pilgrims drank wine as part of devotional routines. Soldiers drank to steady their nerves. Merchants drank to endure the monotony of long roads. Sailors drank to survive nearly everything. You sit with them, letting the warmth of the fire chase away the chill that's creeping into your bones. A pilgrim in a cloak patched with dozens of symbols, a scallop shell from Compostela, a cross from Rome, a crude drawing that he might be Jerusalem leans forward and tells you that he once travelled 4 days on nothing but small ale, dried fish, and divine optimism. You nod, respectfully. In medieval terms, that makes him a professional. A younger man rummages in his pack and pulls out a flask of early aquavitae. He unscrews it, takes a swig that leaves him blinking like he's briefly met God, then hands it to you. No pressure, he says. You take the tiniest sip imaginable. Fire spreads through your chest. Your lungs file a complaint. The pilgrim thumps your back sympathetically. That, he says, is how sailors survive storms. You believe him. A quirky tidbit dances into your mind. Some medieval travellers diluted wine with herbs meant to protect the stomach from corruption. Whether the herbs did anything is debatable, but the wine definitely did. Even monks on pilgrimage carried their own travel flasks of spiced ale or medicinal wine tonics. Later that night, the merchant points toward the distant silhouette of the forest. "Bandits out there," he whispers. "But they don't bother us." "Why not?" you ask. He grins, taps his jug, and says, "Liquid courage. Bandits don't want to fight a drunk man with nothing to lose." You're not sure that's historically accurate, but it is absolutely medieval logic. Historians still argue whether travelling drunk was genuinely practical or wildly irresponsible. Some chroniclers condemned travellers for being foolishly emboldened by drink. Others noted that fear of the dark, wolves, or outlaws drove many people to drink intentionally before setting out at night. The truth, as always, sits somewhere in the messy middle. A sudden gust of wind rustles the leaves overhead. The pilgrim stands and tightens his cloak. "We move at dawn," he says. "Roads are safer early." You follow them to a shabby roadside inn, a timber structure leaning slightly, but still standing proudly like an old drunk uncle who refuses to fall over. Inside, the common room is warm and smoky. Travellers sleep on benches, straw pallets, or anywhere horizontal. The innkeeper, grumpy but efficient, ladles thick ale into mugs with the air of someone who has seen too much. You find a seat and watch as a band of young minstrels stagger in, laughing as they bump into tables. They trade coins for mugs and start telling tales of near misses on dangerous roads. One swears he saw a ghost. Another swears he saw a woman in white floating above the river. A third swears he saw his own donkey go into a tavern without him. Everyone laughs. Everyone drinks. The innkeeper mutters, "Another night, another story," and goes back to his work. Later, as you step back outside under the starlit sky, you hear distant hooves. A group of mounted messengers rides past, cloaks billowing, satchels bouncing, flasks tied securely at their belts. They don't slow, they don't speak, but you catch a whiff of wine as they pass. Medieval messengers rode long, dangerous routes, and stamina was everything. A sip here and there didn't hinder them. Sometimes it kept them sane. You sit on a low stone wall, listening to the night, the crickets, the wind, the occasional owl calling from the trees. And then, faintly, from the direction of the coast, you hear something else. Singing. Deep. Loud. Wild. Sailors. You wander toward the docks, where a ship is unloading late cargo. The sailors sit on crates, passing around a jug of rum-like distilled brew brought from foreign shores. They invite you without hesitation, because in sailor culture, the fastest way to be accepted is to join the circle. You sip. The burn is familiar now. One sailor pounds your back in approval. "First time?" You nod. He laughs. "You'll get used to it. Or you'll die." Either way, problem solved. Sailors drank because of boredom, danger, cold, and tradition, all blended together like some chaotic maritime cocktail. They toasted to safe voyages, cursed at bad weather, and sang loudly enough to scare away sea monsters, or at least pretend they did. You watch as they finish their song and load the last barrel onto the ship. One sailor stands, wobbling slightly, and says, "Drink makes the journey shorter." The others raise their mugs, and the story's longer. They erupt into laughter that ripples across the water. You stay a little longer, watching the moonlight glimmer on the waves, feeling the warm buzz in your chest, a traveler among travelers. And as the night deepens, you realize medieval people didn't travel sober. They couldn't. The roads were too long, too dark, too dangerous, too lonely. Alcohol didn't just warm them. It steadied them, connected them, carried them forward along those winding roads that tied the medieval world together. In the end, the journey wasn't made on foot alone. It was made on courage, companionship, and whatever was sloshing in the flask tied to your belt. You drift away from the docks, the sailors' voices still echoing faintly over the water, and wander toward a quieter edge of town where lamplight glows through shuttered windows. The night has settled into that soft medieval stillness, crickets humming, distant dogs barking, an occasional cart creaking over uneven stones. Your footsteps slow, your breath evens out, and subtly, gently, another truth of medieval life nudges into focus. Alcohol wasn't just for drinking. It was medicine. Or, at least medieval people believed it was. Tonight, you step into the world of medieval remedies, where ale healed, wine cured, and distilled spirits were considered nothing short of miracle tonics. Whether or not they worked is a different question entirely. A small wooden sign creaks overhead. Physician and apothecary. You push the door open, and a warm herbal fog immediately envelops you. Shelves line the walls, packed with jars, powders, roots, leaves, oils, and mysterious liquids suspended in glass. A physician in a long robe, half scholar, half wizard, entirely confident, peers at you from behind round spectacles. "You look well enough," he says, voice soft but deliberate. "But everyone needs a tonic." He says it the way a bartender says, "First one's on the house." He gestures toward a long wooden table covered in mortars, pestles, and dozens of small stoppered bottles. "Wine for digestion," he says, pointing. "Ale for strength." He lifts a tiny flask reverently. "Aqua vitae," for nearly everything. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval medical texts praised alcohol as a versatile healing agent. Wine was used to clean wounds, mix herbal medicines, soothe stomachaches, and revive weak patients. Ale was recommended for fevers, exhaustion, and warming the humors. Spirits were believed to carry the extracted virtue of herbs and were prescribed for internal and external ailments. The physician hands you a cup of warm mulled wine, steeped with rosemary and honey. "For clarity," he explains, "of the mind and the spirit." You sip. It tastes like comfort disguised as a cure. You immediately understand why medieval people trusted this stuff. He leans over a manuscript filled with spidery handwriting and illustrations of plants. "Wine," he says, tapping a page, "preserves the body, thickens the blood, fortifies the stomach." Another tap. "Ale nourishes, restores moisture, helps one sleep." Then he frowns at a third page, an early treatise on spirits. "But this," he says, pointing to the swirling script, "this is new. We still debate it." Historians still argue whether medieval physicians genuinely understood the pharmacological effects of alcohol, or whether they simply observed short-term relief and filled in the rest with humor theory. Many believed alcohol balanced the four humors, warming cold temperaments, thinning thick ones, and stimulating sluggish organs. Modern science says, absolutely not. Medieval doctors said, write it down anyway. A matron enters with her teenage son holding his arm. "He fell," she says. "From where?" the physician asks. "A wall," he sighs. "How much had he drunk?" She hesitates. "Enough." The physician nods knowingly. Without judgment, he pours aqua vitae onto a cloth and presses it to the scrape on the boy's wrist. The boy winces, jerks back, and makes the universal, "this burns worse than heartbreak" face. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Early distilled spirits were used primarily for external treatment, not drinking. They cleaned wounds, disinfected tools, relieved joint pain, and soothed bruises. Some doctors mixed spirits with herbs to create balms, ointments, and tinctures believed to ward off infection or draw out evil humors. The physician moves around the small room with practiced ease. A woman comes in complaining of a headache. He hands her a cup of ale infused with chamomile. A man with a cough receives spiced wine heated slowly over embers. A toddler with a fever gets a mixture of weak ale and ground fennel to restore moisture. To a modern observer, this looks risky at best, but for medieval people, it worked often enough to feel reliable. And where it didn't work, well, placebo effect is older than the pyramids. The physician beckons you over to a shelf lined with dusty scrolls. Here, he says, unrolling one. Ancient wisdom. The scroll contains recipes for dozens of medicinal wines, rose infused for melancholy, mint for indigestion, sage for sore throats, wormwood wine for sluggish digestion, and, incidentally, nightmares. He seems extremely proud of this. You sip your mulled wine again. Warmth blooms. Clarity, somewhat. He notices your expression. See? It heals. You smile politely, but medicinal drinking didn't stop in apothecaries. As you leave the small shop and step back into the night, you see a midwife hurrying down the lane, carrying a leather bag. She nods at you as she passes, and you catch a glimpse of a small flask tucked beside her herbs. Childbirth was terrifying in medieval times. Midwives often gave women ale or wine to relax them, warm their bodies, ease pain, or simply make the ordeal slightly bearable. Another small flask held stronger spirits, rare, expensive, used only when necessary. Midwives learned quickly what eased panic, what calmed trembling, what helped a mother push through fear and exhaustion. You see her disappear into a cottage lit from within. The faint moans of labor drift through the wood and thatch. The midwife's voice follows gentle, steady. A lull between contractions, a sip of warm ale, encouragement, warm hands, soft words. You keep walking, feeling a tug in your chest. Medieval medicine was imperfect, often dangerous, often wrong, but it was deeply human. Farther down the lane, an old shepherd sits on a stool rubbing his knee. He dips a cloth into a small bowl of herbal spirit infusion and presses it against his joint. Good for the aches, he mutters, especially when the cold sets in. You sit beside him for a moment, the smell of rosemary and alcohol rising in the air. He tells you his remedy came from a wandering healer. Could be lies, he says, but it works, so I don't question it. And honestly, hard to argue, because in a world of limited tools, constant labor, and aching bodies, alcohol offered relief that felt immediate, even if temporary. It soothed minds, numbed pain, cleaned wounds, and above all, it gave people comfort real or imagined. You rise slowly and begin walking back toward the heart of town. The stars are bright overhead, and the buzz from your mulled wine wraps around you like a soft blanket. Tonight, you've seen another side of medieval drinking. Not pleasure, not celebration, not escape, but healing, or at least the best approximation of healing a medieval world could offer. And as the wind rustles the eaves above you, you find yourself thinking that maybe, just maybe, alcohol wasn't only a drink in medieval Europe. It was a medicine cabinet in a bottle. You leave the apothecary's warm, herb-scented glow behind and step into the cool medieval night. The moon hangs low, street lamps flicker, and somewhere in the distance you hear the faint call of an owl, soft, eerie, familiar. Your footsteps carry you toward the town's edge again, where the roads stretch into farmland and the houses thin out. And here, under this quiet sky, a sobering truth settles in. For all its comfort, laughter, and companionship, medieval drinking could turn dangerous, sometimes quietly, sometimes explosively, and sometimes in ways people still whisper about generations later. Tonight, you walk through those darker edges of the story. Ahead, you hear shouting, not the playful, tipsy kind, but the sharp, clenched kind that slices through the air like a thrown dagger. You round a corner and see two men in the middle of the lane, faces red, fists balled, breath steaming in the cold. A broken mug lies on the ground between them, ale soaking into the dirt. It started, you quickly realize, over nothing. Almost all medieval fights did. A spilled drink, a misunderstood gesture, a drunken boast, a jealous glance. People lived hard lives. Tension simmered close to the surface. Ale loosened tongues, lowered inhibitions, and turned tiny sparks into sudden blaze. The men lunge, a woman shouts, a child cries. Before things escalate further, neighbors burst from their doors, grabbing collars, dragging both men apart. The village doesn't tolerate prolonged violence, not because they fear the law, but because they need each other too much to let drunken anger tear the fabric of their small world. You step back, watching the scene dissolve into muttering and apologies. One man is marched home by his wife, the other by his brother. Tomorrow they'll pretend this never happened. A. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval court rolls are packed with cases of alcohol-fueled violence, brawls, knife fights, assaults, broken bones, even deaths. Chroniclers often noted that strong drink was involved, though the specifics varied. In some regions, drunken violence was so common that towns passed local ordinances banning weapons after sunset, specifically because of tavern incidents. But violence wasn't the only danger. As you move farther down the lane, you pass a house where people whisper in frantic tones. The air smells of smoke, thick, acrid, unsettling. A bucket lies overturned near the door. You realize what happened long before anyone says it. Someone knocked over a candle after drinking too much. Fire, the medieval fear that sat in everyone's bones. It didn't take much. A spilled lantern, a candle brushed by a cloak, embers kicked from the hearth. Alcohol made people sloppy, clumsy with their steps, careless with flames, slow to notice danger. Houses were tinderboxes of wood, wool, and thatch. Whole neighborhoods vanished in minutes. A man stands outside the house now, face wet, either from bucket water or tears. He mutters a prayer under his breath, staring at the charred doorframe. Luckily, neighbors managed to douse the flames early. No one was hurt, but the fear lingers like smoke in the air. A quirky tidbit you recall. One medieval town required taverns to keep buckets of sand by the door to smother lanterns dropped by intoxicated guests. Another required men to leave torches with guards at the gate when entering town at night after drinking. People weren't worried about drunken rebellion, they were worried about drunken fire. You keep walking. The road winds toward the fields, where a small group of boys stands near a well. They hold a limp shape in their hands, a chicken. One boy mumbles that they only wanted to race them. Another says they just gave it some ale to make it faster. The chicken, unsurprisingly, did not become faster. You sigh. Drunken animal mishaps were surprisingly common. Medieval accounts mentioned drunken goats, drunken donkeys, drunken pigs, and even drunken geese that caused much trouble to the village. Animals wandered freely through tavern yards and festivals. They were curious, opportunistic, and lacked the ability to read warning labels. But the most dangerous form of drunkenness wasn't violence, fire, or unfortunate poultry. It was scandal. You reach the edge of the village just as a small commotion stirs near the church. A cluster of villagers whisper, their expressions a blend of amusement and condemnation. At the center stands a young man, dazed, weaving slightly while a red-faced nobleman shouts at him. You pick up fragments. You insulted my wife. You danced on the table. You claimed you were a knight. You tried to kiss the bishop's ring. You wince, not because of the actions taverns have seen worse, but because of who saw them. Medieval society revolved around reputation, honor, standing, status, and alcohol could unravel that in a single night. Historians still argue whether medieval social norms were stricter than ours or simply enforced by more immediate consequences. But one thing is certain. A drunken insult to the wrong person could ruin relationships, trigger feuds, or land someone in serious trouble. The nobleman storms off. The young man is left behind, deflated, mortified, and suddenly much more sober than before. You continue your walk, the moon rising higher, pastures open ahead. A wooden fence creaks in the wind. You pause beside a field and let the night settle around you. And in that quiet, you see it. Two figures moving slowly along the road, a man guiding his wife, who clings to his arm, unsteady on her feet. Not from drunken celebration, but from something heavier. Injury, illness, or exhaustion. He carries a small flask at his belt, a medicinal mixture, a last resort. Alcohol as anesthesia, disinfectant, courage. Danger wasn't always external. Sometimes the drinker wasn't the threat life was. Across the dark horizon, you hear wolves howling in the distance. The man flinches. You don't blame him. Medieval nights were full of hazards, wild animals, bandits, freezing temperatures. A flask of strong drink made them feel a little less daunting. A small lie of warmth against a cold, uncaring world. You take a deep breath. The chill brushing your lungs, and the weight of everything settles. Drinking lifted medieval people, comforted them, healed them, connected them. But it also burned homes, started fights, damaged reputations, clouded judgment, risked lives. Medieval drinking wasn't glamorous. It wasn't reckless hedonism. It was human, warm and dangerous, comforting and chaotic, necessary and risky. A balancing act walked on uneven roads, flickering candles, and unsteady legs. You turn back toward the glow of the town, the night deepening behind you. The dangers recede into darkness, but the awareness lingers. Every cup held a story, and not all of them ended well. You make your way back toward town, the moon high and pale above the slanted rooftops, and the night settling into that soft medieval hum, the creak of shutters, distant footsteps, a dog barking once, and then deciding it's too tired to continue. You feel the weight of everything you've seen, the joy, the danger, the comfort, the chaos. And now, as you wander deeper into the quiet heart of the village, another truth slips into focus. Complete sobriety was rare, really rare. So rare, in fact, that people sometimes found it suspicious. You walk past a row of houses where thin smoke rises from chimneys. Inside, families sit near flickering hearths, sipping small ale with supper. Not to get drunk, but because water isn't trusted, and habit is hardwired into daily life. You notice something you hadn't paid attention to before. Everyone has a mug. Even the children have tiny ones. Ale is as ordinary as air, woven seamlessly into the rhythm of morning, midday, evening. A man carrying firewood passes you. He nods, cheerful, then takes a sip from his jug before continuing. To him, this isn't drinking. It's hydration, a mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europeans consumed astonishing amounts of ale and wine by modern standards, often 2 to 3 liters a day for adults, depending on climate, occupation, and local customs. But this didn't mean they were stumbling through life in a perpetual blackout. Most of that drink was weak, mild, meant to sustain rather than intoxicate. Still, sobriety was uncommon. You reach the town well, quiet at this hour except for 2 elderly men sitting on the stone rim, sharing a small jug of something dark. They're discussing the weather, the harvest, village gossip, and the eternal mystery of why goats insist on screaming at night. When they see you, one raises his jug. "You look sober," he says. It is not a compliment. It is a diagnosis. "That's not good for your humours," the other adds, tapping the side of his head. In medieval humour theory, an unbalanced mind or body could be caused by too much dryness, too much cold, too much melancholy. Sobriety, complete sobriety, was sometimes associated with those same discomforts. Alcohol warmed the body, lifted the spirits, thinned the blood, steadied the nerves. People believed it kept them healthy, especially during cold seasons. But beyond science or pseudoscience, there was culture. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Chroniclers wrote occasionally of men given to water drinking, as if it were a character flaw. Suspicious, strange, a bit eccentric. Drinking only water implied poverty, illness, or downright stubbornness. In some places, refusing alcohol at a gathering was vaguely insulting, like refusing hospitality. You leave the well and stroll toward a cluster of small cottages near the fields. Through one open door, you glimpse a family eating dinner by lamplight. Rye bread, onions, salted fish, and a pottery jug passed slowly between them. It's a quiet ritual, but a universal one. In another house, you see a woman dipping a ladle into a cask of small ale to fill her children's cups before bed. Not enough to intoxicate, just enough to hydrate and comfort. Even toddlers drank small ale, tiny humans with tiny buzzes. You continue walking and spot a hay cart by the roadside. A young man sits atop it, staring into the night with the philosophical intensity of someone who has had exactly one strong ale too many. You greet him. You sober? He asks. You hesitate. He frowns. Why? Something wrong? The question is so genuine, so earnest, it almost makes you laugh. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly distrusted sober individuals, or whether this impression comes mainly from satirical texts. But the patterns are persistent. Sober individuals were sometimes labelled as severe, dull, unfriendly, or overly pious. Drinking wasn't just acceptable, it was social glue. Being sober in a drinking world made you noticeable. And being noticeable was rarely desirable. You wander past the tavern you visited earlier. It's calmer now, just a few stragglers finishing their drinks. Voices low, mugs half empty. Even here, sobriety stands out. You overhear a tavern keeper whisper to a serving maid. He's been here 2 hours and hasn't ordered a drink. The maid gasps softly. Strange man. Outside, a group of young villagers chat under a lantern. One sits apart, arms folded, cup untouched. The others nudge him. Drink, one whispers. You're making us nervous. I'm fine, he insists. Exactly, another says. That's the problem. You snort softly. Medieval peer pressure wasn't subtle. But sobriety did exist rarely, and it usually came with a story. A vow of temperance, a religious fast, a medical prescription, poverty, pregnancy, or someone recovering from a particularly catastrophic feast night. But otherwise, you drank something. Every day. Almost every hour. And as you pass a stable, you see a groom leaning on the fence, sipping from a mug between chores. He offers you some. You politely decline. He narrows his eyes. You sick? No. Troubled? No. He leans closer. Possessed? You burst out laughing. He looks relieved. Good, he says, handing you a small ale anyway. Just a sip, or people will talk. You take it. Because at this point, it's easier than explaining. You sip. It's mild, thin, watery, barely alcoholic. But even this tiny drink smooths the edge between you and the world, slipping you back into the shared rhythm everyone else seems to operate on. Walking again, you feel the soft warmth settle in your chest. Not tipsy, just normal. Medieval normal. And slowly, the truth becomes clear. Medieval sobriety wasn't rare because people lacked self-control. It was rare because alcohol was water. Water that wouldn't kill you. Water that eased fatigue. Water that calmed the mind. Water that kept communities bonded in a world where every day required cooperation. Sobriety meant standing apart. And standing apart, in a small medieval village, was the most dangerous thing of all. You follow the quiet village lanes until the night softens into something almost tender. The tavern is closing. Hearth fires dim behind shuttered windows. The moon leans low over thatched roofs, painting the world in silver. And finally, you feel the medieval day settling the way medieval days always did. With a nightcap. Not a wild drink. Not a feast cup. Not a drinking game challenge. Just that final, gentle sip taken before bed, the warm sigh at the end of a long, brutal, beautiful day. You're drawn toward a small cottage at the end of the lane, where a soft glow spills onto the dirt path. Inside, the family is finishing their supper. The father lifts a small cup of ale, barely half a mug, and takes a thoughtful sip, then passes it to his wife. She takes a small drink too, smiling at the warmth. Even their teenage son gets a watered-down taste before heading to his straw pallet. This is the medieval nightcap. Something quiet, simple, grounding. A mainstream historical fact. Most medieval people ended their evenings with small ale, a weak brew meant not for intoxication but for sleep. It soothed the stomach, relaxed tired muscles, chased off the cold. Medieval physicians even recommended it as a sleep aid, insisting it loosens the limbs and comforts the mind before rest. You sit at their table for a moment, sharing the dim, peaceful glow. The mother offers you a small cup, barely more than a sip. It tastes like the day itself, grainy, warming, humble. A drink meant for settling, not stirring. Outside, you hear a goat bleat once before deciding the night isn't worth arguing with. A dog curls beside the hearth. A baby sighs softly in sleep. Everything is still. You step back into the cool air, letting the door close gently behind you. Farther up the road, another home glows warmly. A grandmother sits by the fire, holding a clay cup of warm spiced wine. She hums softly, a tune her mother taught her, and her mother before that. She catches your eye, lifts the cup in greeting, and whispers, "Good dreams." A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind. Some medieval households believed a sip of wine or ale before bed protected the sleeper from nightmares or wandering spirits. People weren't necessarily superstitious about the drink itself, they were superstitious about everything, but the nightcap became part of a comforting ritual, a tiny shield against a world full of uncertainty. You walk on. At the edge of town, a shepherd finishes tying his animals in for the night. He takes one sip from a wineskin and nods to himself. "Helps the bones," he mutters, and quiets the mind. Then he looks at you. You sleep easier with a little warmth. Medieval people knew the value of these moments, the pause at the end of the day, the small blessing of a warm drink held in both hands. The kind of drink that didn't change your mood or muddle your thoughts, just softened them. Historians still argue whether nightly drinks were universal or simply common, but all the evidence points to this truth. In the Middle Ages, ending the day with a cup wasn't indulgence, it was routine, comfort, stability in a world without clocks, electricity, or predictable tomorrows. You continue walking until you reach a quiet hill overlooking the village. The rooftops glow faintly from dying hearths. The wind rustles through the grass. You sit, knees drawn in, holding your own small cup, your final drink of the night. A little ale borrowed from a friendly neighbor who insisted you shouldn't go to bed thirsty. You take your last sip. It isn't remarkable. It isn't strong. It isn't memorable. But it's exactly right. The warmth spreads through you like a lantern. Behind your ribs, your eyes grow heavy. Your shoulders loosen. The world slows into long, soft breaths. This is how medieval people ended their days. Not with drama, not with revelry, not with danger, but with quiet, with warmth, with that final exhale before sleep. And as you stand and head back down the hill, the night embracing you like a blanket, you realize medieval drunkenness wasn't a story of wild nights. It was a story of humanity, of escape, resilience, celebration, ritual, and rest. Ale in the morning, wine at the feast, spirits in the workshop, and at the end of it all, a sleepy, simple nightcap that brought the day gently to its knees. You return to your little corner of the medieval world, sit beside the fading embers of the hearth, and let the warmth settle into you. Tomorrow will bring work, and noise, and struggle, and drink, and laughter, but for now, you drink your last quiet sip, and let your eyes fall closed. And now, let everything soften. Let the night wrap gently around you, the way medieval evenings once wrapped around weary villagers after long days of labor, stories, and laughter. Imagine that quiet hill again, the one where the whole world below glows like a cluster of sleepy fireflies. Feel the cool air brushing against your cheeks, slow and tender. Imagine holding that small, warm cup between your hands, its heat seeping into your fingers, steadying your breath. The sounds of the day fade further and further away. The shouts from the tavern, the clatter of mugs, the music, even the distant arguments. All of it melts into a low, comforting hum somewhere far behind you. What's left is only calm, only softness, only night. Your shoulders loosen, sinking just a little deeper. Your jaw unclenches. Your thoughts begin to drift, like leaves floating on a quiet river. The medieval world around you settles too. The hearth embers glow their last reddish-orange size. Animals nestle into straw. Lamps flicker, then dim. And, across the village, one home at a time, small windows go dark until the whole place sleeps. Let yourself drift with them. Let the warmth in your chest spread slowly downward through your ribs, your stomach, your legs. Let your breath deepen into something slow and easy, as though your whole body is remembering what rest feels like. Nothing is urgent now. Nothing needs your attention. You're safe. You're warm. You're here. And as the final medieval nightcap cools beside you, your mind settles into stillness, soft, quiet, and ready to slip gently into sleep. The village sleeps, the world sleeps, and soon you will too.